Hey, welcome back, my friend. I am so glad you're here tonight. Wherever you are right now, tucked under a blanket, lying in the dark with your pillow, maybe on the couch with the lights already dimmed, I want you to take one slow breath and let your shoulders settle. Because tonight, we're not going anywhere rushed. We're going somewhere very old and very warm and very far from anything that needed your attention today. Tonight, we're stepping inside a medieval castle. Not the cartoon version, not the fairy tale postcard with the glittering turrets, the real one. Stone walls that breathe cold even in summer. Corridors so narrow 2 people cannot pass without turning sideways. A kitchen that never fully goes quiet. And somewhere near the top of one of those towers, behind a door reinforced with iron, a noblewoman is sitting by the last of the evening light, and she's doing something so ordinary it might surprise you. But before I tell you what she's doing, before we walk through those gates and follow the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat down into the great hall, I need to tell you a few things about where we're actually going. Because a medieval castle, the real version of one, is nothing like what most of us picture. And the difference between the picture in our heads and the truth is where this story actually gets interesting. Here is what most people do not know about medieval castles in the 1400s. A significant English or French castle of that period could have anywhere from 200 to 500 people living and working inside its walls on any given day. Not visiting. Living. That is a small town contained inside a single fortified structure. The castle was not just a noble family's home, it was a functioning economic engine, a military base, a court of law, a place of worship, a food production facility, and a social hierarchy so elaborately layered that where you slept, what you ate, and whether anyone bothered to learn your name all depended on the precise rung of the ladder you occupied. A great castle like Windsor or the Château de Vincennes near Paris would have cost the equivalent of tens of millions of modern dollars to build. Some estimates for the largest projects reach well above the equivalent of 100 million. And building them took not years but generations, with successive lords adding towers, expanding great halls, deepening moats, reinforcing walls that had already been standing for a century. And here is the detail that stops people cold every time. The lord and lady of such a castle might occupy less than 1/5 of the total space. The rest belonged to everyone else. The steward and his staff, the cook and her army, the grooms, the laundresses, the falconers, the chaplain, the pages, the knights, the guards who never slept at the same time. A castle was not a home with servants, it was a world, and the noble family simply lived at the centre of it. That is where we are starting tonight. Not at the top of the hierarchy, not at the bottom. We're going to walk through the whole thing together, one evening, one woman at a time. So pull up something warm, get comfortable, and let us go back, all the way back, to the year 1415 or so, give or take a decade, somewhere in the English countryside, or perhaps the Loire Valley of France. The details will shift a little as we move, because castles were not identical from country to country, or even from estate to estate. But the feeling, the smell of stone and tallow, the sound of 50 people going about their evening inside walls 3 feet thick, that feeling was universal. And if this kind of quiet storytelling is something that settles you, that makes the end of your day feel a little softer and a little more interesting, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button for Sleepy Old World. It genuinely keeps this channel alive, and it means everything to me when I see a new name appear. Leave a like if something I say tonight makes you lean in a little, And if you want to tell me where you are in the world right now, your bedroom, your living room, some dark corner of the house that is finally just yours for an hour, drop it in the comments. I love knowing. All right. Dim the lights if you can. Let the room go soft. And come with me. It is late afternoon. Not quite evening yet, but getting there. The light has gone from gold to amber, and inside the castle walls things have been shifting for the past hour in the particular way they shift every single day at this time. A kind of organised quickening, a whole complicated machine preparing itself for the night ahead. Picture the gatehouse first. That is where almost everyone enters, and it tells you something important about what this place is. The gatehouse of a proper 1400s castle is not an entrance so much as a statement. The walls on either side of the main gate might be 15 or 20 feet thick enough that there is a room or two built into the wall itself, where guards keep their equipment, their fire, their dice games. The portcullis, that heavy iron grate that can be dropped in seconds, hangs suspended overhead, and even when it is raised, most people passing underneath it glance up reflexively. It is that kind of architecture. It is designed to remind you of what it could do. But tonight, the portcullis is up, and the traffic moving through the gate is quiet and domestic. A cart is coming in from the nearby village, piled with cabbages and dried peas, and the 2 oxen pulling it are moving with the particular slow dignity of animals who have made this trip so many times they could do it without a driver. Behind the cart, a group of laundresses is returning with linens that have been washed at the river. Great coils of damp linen balanced in wooden baskets on their heads, their arms free, their backs straight, their conversation low and continuous. They have been at the river since mid-morning. This is not a complaint. This is simply Tuesday. Now, let us follow someone specific. Because the best way to understand what an evening inside this castle actually felt like is not to describe the architecture, though we will get to that, but to follow a person through it. And the person I want to follow tonight is a woman. Her name is Margery. She's perhaps 35 years old, which in 1415 is solidly middle-aged. Not old, but past the age when anyone is still using the word young to describe her. She's the wife of a minor lord, not a duke, not a king, not anyone whose name will end up in the history books, but a man of property and standing, with a castle of modest but real size, 40 or 50 rooms, a garrison of perhaps 30 soldiers, a household staff of 60 or 70 people who orbit her life the way planets orbit a sun. She is not the most powerful woman in this story. She is the most ordinary powerful woman, which is actually the more interesting kind. Margery's day has been long. Medieval noblewomen of her class did not spend their days in idle decorative pursuits, despite what the illuminated manuscripts sometimes suggest with their images of ladies sitting in gardens playing lutes. She has been managing the household since before the morning prayers. She has reviewed the kitchen accounts with the steward, a meticulous, slightly humourless man named Thomas who has served this household for 20 years and who communicates his opinions mostly through his eyebrows. She has spoken with the head cook about the provisions for the week. She has received a message from her husband's estate manager about a dispute over a fence line on the southern pasture, and she has sent a letter back in her own hand. Yes, she can read and write, which not everyone of her station could, and she considers it one of the more useful things her father ever gave her. She has overseen the mending of a tapestry in the cellar, checked on a laundress who has been ill for 3 days, and settled a small but heated disagreement between 2 of the younger household women about who was responsible for the state of the rushes in the lesser hall. By the time the light shifts from gold to amber, that particular late afternoon quality that turns the stone walls of the inner courtyard the colour of warm honey, Margery has been on her feet for 9 hours, but the evening is not over. The evening, in fact, is only just beginning. Let us slow down here for a moment and talk about what this castle actually looks like from the inside, because it matters enormously for understanding everything that happens after dark. We have a tendency to imagine medieval castles as austere and cold, all bare stone and smoky torches and the occasional wolf pelt on a floor. The reality, at least for a household of Margery's standing in the early 1400s, was considerably more layered and, in places, genuinely beautiful. The Great Hall is the heart of everything. It always has been, going back centuries, and by the 1400s it has reached a kind of refined maturity as an architectural space. In a castle of moderate size, not Windsor, not a royal palace, but a well-established noble household, the Great Hall might be 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a ceiling that reaches up 20 or 25 feet to exposed timber beams darkened by decades of smoke. The floor is stone, covered with rushes, dried grasses and herbs mixed together, strewn across the floor and changed every few weeks, or more often if someone has been careless. There is almost always a raised dais at one end, slightly elevated from the rest of the hall, where the lord and lady and their most honoured guests will eat, and at the other end a screens passage, a wooden partition with doors cut through it, that separates the hall from the service areas beyond, the buttery, the pantry, the corridor that leads to the kitchen. The Great Hall during the day is used for a dozen different purposes. Petitions are heard there, disputes are settled, meals are served at long trestle tables that are set up and broken down twice daily. On a cold afternoon, it is also simply where people gather, because the hall's central hearth, a large open fire built directly on the stone floor in older castles, or in a side fireplace in more modern ones, is one of the few places in the entire building that generates enough heat to make a room genuinely warm. The smell of the Great Hall is specific and unforgettable, wood smoke, and underneath it the faintly sweet, faintly animal smell of the rushes when they are fresh, and underneath that, the persistent memory of every meal that has ever been eaten in this room. Fats and spices and wine soaked into the stone walls over generations. Off the Great Hall, running up through the main tower, are the private rooms. And this is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the difference between the rooms available to different people in this household is not just a matter of comfort, it is a matter of an entirely different relationship with the concept of privacy itself. Margery's chamber, the lord's and lady's private cellar as it would have been called, is on the upper floor of the main tower. To reach it, you climb a spiral staircase cut into the tower wall, stone steps worn smooth in the centre from generations of feet. The door at the top is solid oak, iron hinged, with a bar that drops across the inside. You step through it, and the first thing you notice is that the room is, by any standard of the era, beautiful, not large. Do not imagine a Victorian bedroom or a modern master suite. The cellar in a castle of Margery's level might be 20 feet by 20 feet, a generous room, but not an enormous one. What makes it feel luxurious is the density of what is inside it. There is a great curtained bed against one wall, a structure that is in itself a feat of carpentry and textile craft. The bed frame is high off the ground, which matters enormously in a stone castle where the floor is always cold. Around it, heavy curtains hang from a canopy frame, and at night those curtains are drawn closed on all four sides, creating a small, dark, warm tent within a room that is Margery's most private world. The mattress is stuffed with wool or feathers if the household can afford them, which Margery's can. Beneath it, a rope framework holds everything up, and beneath that, a second smaller mattress, sometimes a trundle that can be rolled out for a waiting woman to sleep nearby. The walls of the cellar are not bare stone, they are hung with tapestries, thick woven panels depicting hunting scenes, or biblical stories, or the kind of decorative foliage and animals that were fashionable in the early 1400s. These tapestries serve two purposes. One is aesthetic. They are genuinely beautiful objects, the product of months of skilled labour in workshops in Flanders or Paris or closer to home, and they signal wealth and taste as clearly as any painting on a wall today. The other purpose is practical. They block the cold. Stone walls in a castle are not insulated. On a winter night, a bare stone wall is simply a surface that has been cold for 1,000 years, and nothing you do in a single evening will warm it. The tapestries create a layer of dead air between the stone and the room, and that layer makes the room livable. There is a fireplace, a proper one, set into the wall, with a chimney that draws the smoke up and out. This is a luxury. In older parts of the castle, in the great hall and in the service areas, fires burn in central hearths, and the smoke finds its way out through louvered openings in the roof, or simply drifts up to the ceiling and hangs there, which is why the high timbers of old great halls are always black. But the cellar has a chimney, and a fire burning in it, and that fire in the late afternoon of an October evening in 1415 is exactly what Margery is walking toward right now. Nadivni. She pushes open the door, steps inside, and for the first time all day, she is alone. Well, almost alone. Her waiting woman, Anne, a younger woman, perhaps 20, the daughter of a minor gentry family who has been placed in Margery's household to learn deportment and household management, which is how noble girls were educated in this period. Anne is already in the cellar, kneeling at the fireplace feeding small pieces of split wood to a fire that is just catching. She looks up when Margery enters. "My lady," she rises, smoothing her skirt. Margery waves a hand in that particular gesture that means, "No, do not stand on ceremony, just keep doing what you are doing." She crosses to the window, a narrow opening in the thick wall, fitted with wooden shutters that are currently half open, and looks out across the inner courtyard. Down below, the activity of the afternoon is still ongoing, but at a different pitch now. The kitchen smoke has thickened. Someone is crossing the courtyard with a lantern already, though the sky is not yet dark. A dog is trotting purposefully toward the stables. In the tower across the way, a candle has appeared in a window. The evening in this castle has begun. Let us step back from Margery for a moment and look at the castle from the outside, because the sheer physical scale of what we are inside is something that is easy to lose track of when we are caught up in the intimate details of a single room. A castle like the one we are imagining, a medium-large English fortified manor of the early 1400s, occupies a footprint that would cover, in modern terms, something like 2 to 4 acres of ground inside its outer walls. The outer walls themselves, the curtain wall, in the technical language of castle architecture, might run for 1/4 of a mile around the perimeter, and in places they might stand 30 or 40 feet high, with a walkway along the top where guards patrol. At the corners and at intervals along the wall, round or square towers project outward, allowing defenders to fire along the face of the wall. There is almost always a moat, or at least a ditch. In England, often a water-filled one. In drier climates, a dry ditch that creates its own obstacle. The main gate has its portcullis, its drawbridge or fixed bridge, its flanking towers. Inside the outer wall, there is typically a large open space, the outer ward or bailey, used for stabling horses, housing livestock, storing equipment and supplies. And inside that, a second inner wall leading to the inner ward, where the main residential and administrative buildings stand. This is not a house, this is a small city, and it runs like one. The number of people required to keep a castle of this size operational would have been, to modern sensibilities, almost staggering. Let us walk through them, because this is the part of the story that most people never hear, not the lords and ladies, but the whole invisible machinery beneath them. At the top of the domestic hierarchy, just below the lord himself, is the steward. This is Thomas, the eyebrow communicator we met earlier. The steward is the castle's chief administrator, its chief financial officer, its human resources department, and its judge of first instance, all rolled into one person. He oversees everything: the accounts, the supply chains, the management of the estate's outlying farms and tenants, the resolution of disputes between household staff, the scheduling of the lord's affairs. A good steward is worth his considerable weight in silver, and a bad one can quietly destroy an estate in a decade. Thomas is a good one. He has been doing this for 20 years, and the accounts, when Margery reviews them, are always correct to the last farthing, which is not something she takes for granted. Below the steward, running the domestic operations of the castle itself, is the chamberlain, specifically responsible for the lord and lady's personal chambers, their clothing, their comfort, the management of the household servants most directly attached to the family. Then the marshal, who oversees the stables and the horses and all transport. The master of the horse, which sounds grand but is essentially the head groom, a man who probably spends 14 hours a day around animals and smells precisely as you would expect. The constable, who is responsible for the castle's military garrison and the security of the structure itself. The almoner, who distributes charity to the poor on behalf of the household, a religious obligation taken seriously, and one that meant there was always, on the days of almsgiving, a queue of people at the castle gate waiting for their portion of bread, or pottage, or old clothing. Then the kitchen, and the kitchen deserves its own paragraph, because the kitchen of a noble castle in the 1400s is something that would astonish most modern people, not in a cozy artisanal way, but in a massive industrial way. The castle kitchen is a large separate building, often stone-vaulted to resist fire, and it is staffed continuously day and night by a team that might number 20 or 30 people. At the head of this team is the master cook, a man of real skill and real status in the household hierarchy, who controls an enormous budget and whose professional reputation is intertwined with the Lord's own honour, because in this period, how you fed your guests said everything about who you were. Beneath the master cook are his assistants, his spit boys, the unfortunate young men whose job it is to turn the roasting spits by hand for hours in front of roaring fires, a position that is as uncomfortable as it sounds, and that was often assigned to the youngest and lowest-ranked kitchen workers, the pastry cook, the sauce cook, the poulterer who handles birds, the slaughterman who does the work that nobody else wants to do. There is also the pantler, who is responsible for bread and the pantry, the butler, who manages wine and ale. Butler comes from the word bouteille, bottle, and a castle butler in the 1400s is genuinely an important figure, because controlling the wine is controlling a significant portion of the household's social life. The ewerer manages the ewers and basins used for hand-washing, which was not an optional formality, but a serious ritual performed before and during meals. The panter and the naperer managed the linens, tablecloths, napkins, the elaborate system of cloths that covered the Lord's table, and then there is the porter at the gate, the laundrywomen at the river, the seamstresses in the sewing room, the grooms in the stables, the falconer with his birds, the gardener managing the herb garden and the small kitchen garden within the walls, the castle chaplain, the physician, if the household was wealthy enough to have one, the chaplain's assistant, the pages, young boys of noble birth, 10 or 12 years old, placed in great households to learn service and eventually knighthood, who at this moment are probably somewhere in the great hall being scolded by someone for some small piece of mischief. All of these people, right now, in the hour between late afternoon and the evening's main event, are moving. The kitchen has been working since dawn, and it will not slow down for another 4 hours. The stables are being cleaned and bedded for the night. The ewerer's boys are filling the great washing basins in the hall. The butler is going down to the cellar to bring up the wine for supper. The laundresses who came through the gate an hour ago are now in the laundry room unloading their baskets, shaking out the damp linen, beginning the process of hanging or folding. The chamberlain has already checked the state of the great hall once and is about to check it again, because the great hall at supper must be perfect, and he is the kind of man who does not leave perfection to chance. And Margery, up in her solar with Anne and the new fire and the last of the afternoon light coming through that half-open shutter, is sitting down in the chair nearest the hearth and picking up a piece of embroidery. Let us talk about embroidery for a moment, because I think it is one of those details that modern people tend to glance past as if they already know what it means, and then miss the actual story inside it entirely. Embroidery for a woman of Margery's class in the 1400s is not a hobby. It is not something she does in her spare time because she enjoys crafting. It is, in the fullest sense of that word, work, important work, work that produces objects of genuine value, objects that will furnish this castle or be given as gifts of serious meaning, work that demonstrates a set of skills that are understood by everyone in her world as fundamental to who she is and what she is worth. The piece on her lap right now, let us say it is a long border for a new altar cloth, commissioned by the castle's chaplain and being worked by Margery and 2 of her ladies over the course of several months, is a dense, meticulous thing. Gold and crimson silk thread on a linen ground, a pattern of vines and birds and small heraldic devices that requires her full attention and a steady hand. She has been working this piece in any spare moment she can find for 6 weeks. The altar cloth will, when finished, be donated to the chapel in her husband's name. Her name will not be attached to it in any formal record. This does not bother her particularly. The work is the work. The chapel benefits. God notices. That is enough. Anne is now settled in the chair across from her, working on a simpler piece, a length of tablet-woven trim that will edge one of the household's better tablecloths. The fire between them cracks softly. Outside the window the light is going. Thor is not silent. It never quite is. Somewhere below the sound of the kitchen carries up, a steady low throb of activity, voices, the clang of something metallic against something else metallic. A dog barks once in the outer ward and then goes quiet. The castle has its own particular sound, a kind of layered ongoing murmur that you stop consciously hearing after a few days of living inside it. But that is always there, the way a river always makes some sound even on a still day. Margery reaches the end of a thread and pauses to rethread her needle, a small silver needle kept in a little embroidered case that hangs from her belt, alongside her keys. The keys! This is something worth pausing on for a moment, because the keys that hang at a noblewoman's belt are not merely practical objects, they are a statement. They are, in the clearest possible visual language, an announcement of authority. A lady of the castle carried the keys to the storerooms, the spice chest, the linen cupboard, the wine cellar in some households, the document chest where important papers were kept. To carry these keys was to control these spaces, and to control these spaces was to control the daily material life of everyone inside these walls. The steward managed the accounts, the constable managed the soldiers, but the lady managed the household, the food, the cloth, the medicines, the stores, and the keys were her authority made physical, hung at her hip and audible with every step she took. There is a wonderful small detail recorded in various household accounts of the period. When a new lady came to a castle through marriage, one of the formal gestures of transfer of household authority was the presentation of the keys by the outgoing mistress, not by the lord, by the woman who had held them before. It was understood that this was her domain to pass on. Boo. Margery threads her needle. She says, without looking up, to Anne, "Do you know what the cook is planning for tonight's supper?" Anne, equally without looking up from her weaving, "Roast capon, my lady, and a pottage of leeks and herbs. Thomas said the venison that was planned will not be ready in time." Boo. Margery makes a small sound that conveys no particular opinion. Capon is fine. It is not venison, but tonight there are no guests of rank, which means the standard of supper can be comfortable rather than impressive, and comfortable suits her tonight very well. Now let us leave the solar for a little while and travel deeper into the castle, down the stairs, through the corridors, into the spaces that most visitors to a modern ruined castle never pause to really imagine, because the working heart of a medieval castle is not the great hall or the towers, it is what lies behind and beneath them. Listen, the kitchen. We should start there, because the kitchen is already, at this hour, the most dramatic room in the entire structure. The castle kitchen in the early 1400s is large, considerably larger than most people imagine, and it is designed around fire with the same totality that a modern industrial kitchen is designed around electricity. There are multiple hearths, each serving a different function. The main roasting hearth might be 8 or 10 feet wide, a vast open arch in the wall with a fire pit in front of it, and iron mechanisms for mounting the spits horizontally across the heat. At this moment, 2 young boys, spit boys, 12 and 14 years old, apprenticed to the kitchen, are stationed in front of this hearth, each one turning a long iron spit on which a capon is slowly revolving in the heat. They have been doing this for the better part of an hour already. Their faces are flushed. The hair nearest their faces is damp with sweat. The heat radiating from that fire is intense in a way that is difficult to describe unless you have stood directly in front of a fire that large. It is not merely warm, it is a physical force pressing against your face and hands, something that requires effort to stand still in, rather than stepping back from. They are not stepping back. This is their job. Over at the subsidiary hearths, other work is proceeding in parallel. A large iron pot hangs over one fire on a chain hooked to a swivel crane. The mechanism allows it to be swung out of the heat for stirring without anyone having to put their hands into the flames, which is an innovation so practical that kitchens adopted it quickly and kept it for centuries. Inside the pot, the leek pottage that Anne mentioned is simmering. Pottage in the 1400s is not soup in the modern sense. It is thicker, more substantial, somewhere between a stew and a porridge, and it forms the foundation of what almost everyone in this castle eats at almost every meal. For the lord and lady's table, the pottage might be enriched with cream or almond milk, thickened with bread crumbs, seasoned with ginger and saffron which costs as much as gold by weight and is used with the same careful parsimony. For the garrison soldiers and the lower household staff, the pottage is made with water and whatever vegetables and scraps the kitchen can spare. It is filling, and it is hot, and in the 1400s that is not nothing. The master cook, whose name is William, a heavy-set man of about 50 with enormous forearms, and the particular combination of confidence and tension that belongs to anyone responsible for feeding 100 people on a schedule, is currently at the center of the kitchen overseeing 3 things simultaneously. He is watching the capon through narrowed eyes, calculating the remaining cooking time from the color of the skin and the sound the dripping fat makes when it hits the embers below. He is tasting the pottage from a long wooden spoon, making the small face that means he is deciding whether it needs more salt, and he is having a low but emphatic conversation with the pantler about the bread, specifically about why the bread from this morning's baking is, in his professional opinion, inadequate, and whose fault that is. The pantler is defending himself. The yeast was slow this morning, he says. It was cold last night, and the dough did not rise properly. William makes the face that communicates. This is your problem, not mine. The bread should have been started earlier. William makes the face that communicates. I started it exactly when I always start it. William looks at the bread. The bread is, objectively, somewhat flat. He picks up a piece, tears it, looks at the interior, sighs. It will do for the lower tables. For the Lord's table, he will send someone to the pantry for the remaining good loaves from yesterday. Well, the day before yesterday, technically, but bread a day old is still bread, and a castle household wastes almost nothing. This, by the way, is one of the things about castle kitchens that I find genuinely fascinating. The hierarchy of food, who gets what, at what quality, is built into every single decision made in this room. The principle is layered and absolute. The best ingredients go to the Lord's table. The next best goes to the upper household, the steward, the chamberlain, the knights, the chaplain. The next goes to the middle staff. What remains after that goes to the lowest level, the spit boys and the stable hands and the laundresses. And what remains after that goes to the alms bowl at the gate. Nothing is wasted, not a bone, not a stale crust, not a handful of vegetable peelings. The kitchen accounts kept by a careful steward would show, week by week, a very precise ledger of what was received, what was prepared, what was consumed, and what was distributed. These account books have survived in some cases. Historians have found them in various English and French archives, and they are, if you know what you are reading, absolutely riveting. They are a record of how a small city fed itself, one day at a time, across decades. But let us leave the kitchen for a moment. The cook has things under control, or at least as under control as a castle kitchen ever is, and follow a different person through a different part of the building. Because the castle before supper is full of parallel stories happening in parallel rooms, and I want you to have a sense of the whole before we settle in for the main event of the evening. Hund. The laundry room is in a lower wing of the castle, near the water source. In an English castle, this might be near a well or a cistern. In a castle built beside a river, there might be a dedicated laundry facility actually at the riverbank. The women who work here, and this is almost exclusively women, laundry being firmly in the female domain of castle labour, have been at their work since before dawn, and they will not finish until well after dark. The load today is substantial. Household linens from the great hall, personal linen from the family's chambers, kitchen cloths, the shirts and undergarments of the garrison soldiers, and the altar cloths from the chapel that need particularly careful handling. Washing in the 1400s is physical labour in the most complete sense. There is no machine, no running hot water, no detergent in a dispenser on the wall. There is lye, a caustic liquid made from wood ash and water, which effectively cleans fabric but is also hard on hands, which is why the hands of laundresses in this period were often rough and reddened even among young women. There are wooden paddles for beating cloth. There are large wooden tubs for soaking and rinsing, and there is the river or the well, which provides the water, and the meadow or the drying yard within the castle walls, which provides the space to dry the washed cloth by spreading it over bushes or hanging it on lines. The head laundry maid, let us call her Joan, because it was a very common name for English women of all classes in the 1400s, is supervising the others with the particular efficiency of someone who has been doing this work for so long that she sees the entire system at once, the backlog of unwashed, the state of what is currently in the tubs, the progress of what is drying. She knows, without being told, that the altar cloths that Margery has been asking about for a week need to be finished today. She has been aware of this all day. The altar cloths are currently in the final rinse stage, which is the delicate stage, and Joan has assigned them to herself rather than to one of the younger girls, because the younger girls have a tendency to wring linen too vigorously and leave it weakened or misshapen. Joan is 42 years old. She has worked in this castle for 25 years. She knows every stone of it. She knows where the damp patches in the lower corridors are and why they appear. She knows which of the kitchen staff are reliable and which are not. She knows every family secret that passes through linen and cloth, which is to say many secrets indeed. She does not share them. That is not what she does. What she does is get the laundry done. Out in the stables, the sounds are different. The stables in a castle of this period are large, low-ceilinged buildings in the outer ward, and they house not just the lords riding horses but the destriers, the trained war horses, big and expensive and temperamental, the palfreds used by the ladies and the priests and the visitors, the rounceys that the soldiers ride, the draught horses used for the carts and the agricultural work of the estate, and in some households, the hunting horses kept specially for the chase. There might be 30 or 40 animals in a working castle's stables on any given day, each one requiring daily care, feeding, watering, grooming, hoof cleaning, the examination of any soreness or illness, the repair of tack, the bedding of the stalls with fresh straw. The master of the horse is currently overseeing the evening feeding, a critical moment when each animal receives its measured portion of hay and grain, and having a quiet argument with one of the grooms about a horse that has been moving oddly on its right foreleg since morning. The groom thinks it is nothing. The master of the horse thinks it might be the beginning of a problem, and his professional instinct, honed over 30 years of working with horses, tells him he should have it looked at before morning. Not that anyone will look at it before morning. The castle's leech, the medical practitioner, somewhere between a physician and a surgeon, will not make night calls for horses, only for people, but the horse will be watched tonight by the youngest groom who draws the short straw and gets to sit up in the stable, wrapped in a horse blanket, trying to stay awake. There is a word for this in castle life, a word for the endless chain of small observations and small responsibilities that keep everything functioning. The word, I suppose, is simply duty, not glory, not adventure, just duty, day after day, in rain and cold and early dark, and the satisfaction of a thing done correctly that nobody will ever notice because it never went wrong. Now, the hour is moving forward. Somewhere in the castle, the chapel tower, probably, or a bell hung above the main gate, a bell rings, not loudly, not urgently, just a single clear tone that moves through the stone corridors and the smoke of the kitchen and the wet warmth of the laundry room, and up into the solar where Margery is putting her embroidery down, finally, and stretching her fingers. Supper. The great hall at supper time is a different creature from the great hall at any other hour of the day. It transforms. The trestle tables, long boards laid across wooden supports that can be set up in minutes and taken down again after the meal, have been set out in rows running the length of the hall, parallel to each other, and then one more table crosswise on the dais at the far end, elevated by its platform from the rest. This is the high table, where Margery and her husband eat on nights when he is in residence, though tonight he is away, handling some piece of estate business 2 days' ride south, and the high table will be occupied by Margery alone, with the steward Thomas sitting at her left and the castle chaplain at her right. The underband is fukrahels. The cloths have been covered with cloths. The cloths are linen, white, or close to white, properly laundered, pressed into their folds by the weight of other linens stacked on top of them in the linen press, which is a large wooden device that works rather like a bookbinding press, and which Joan considers one of the most useful pieces of equipment in her domain. The smoothness of the table linen, actually, is one of those small details that everyone in the hall notices and nobody in the hall remarks on, because when it is correct, it is simply correct. When it is not correct, wrinkled or grey or spotted, it is noticed by everyone and speaks against the household's reputation in ways that nobody who has not lived this life entirely understands. On the high table, the napkin is folded. This is not the simple fold of a modern restaurant napkin. The napkin at a formal medieval table is a substantial piece of linen, sometimes several feet square, and the manner of its folding communicates something about the standing of the table. There are records of medieval household manuals, books written for the specific purpose of training servants in their duties, that describe elaborate napkin folds, one for a high lord's table, another for lesser tables, particular foldings for feast days, for ordinary suppers, for mourning occasions. The boy responsible for the napkins at this table has been in the household for 2 years and has been taught very specifically how to fold them. He is 12 years old, serious in the way that 12-year-olds sometimes are when they have been entrusted with something that matters, and he has done the napkins correctly. The salt cellar is on the high table. This matters. You may have heard the phrase below the salt. It is an expression that has survived into modern English, though most people who use it today have completely forgotten where it came from. In a medieval castle, the great salt cellar, typically a large, decorative vessel that might be made of silver or silver gilt in a wealthy household, ceramic or pewter in a more modest one, sat on the table at a specific point, and that point marked the boundary between those of high status and those of lower status sitting at the same table. Those above the salt, physically on the far side of the salt cellar from the main door, closest to the dais end, were people of rank. Those below the salt were of lesser standing. If you were seated below the salt at someone's supper, you were being very clearly told where you stood. The salt cellar was social architecture, made edible. Whoa, whoa! In Margery's hall tonight, the great salt, which is silver, cast in the shape of a small ship, because that form was fashionable, and the lord had bought it at considerable expense some years ago, as a gift to himself on the occasion of a successful legal dispute, is placed on the high table between the steward's position and the chaplain's. It catches the light from the wall sconces and gleams. It is about 8 inches tall. Its sails are deployed. Let us talk about the lighting, because this is the detail that changes everything about how you see a castle evening, and I think it is the single most important thing to understand about what it felt like to be inside these walls after dark. The castle has torches. You know this. What you may not have fully absorbed is that the torches of a medieval castle are not decorative and not atmospheric, and do not in fact do what the movies suggest they do. A single wall torch in a stone corridor provides enough light to walk by without crashing into things. It does not illuminate a room. A torch is a safety light. It marks the path. The actual living light of the castle comes from candles. Candles in a castle household are a major expense, and they are managed with the same care as wine or spices. There are tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, primarily mutton tallow, which burn adequately but produce smoke and have a distinctive smell that is not unpleasant when you are used to it, but is very specific, something fatty and slightly sweet, the smell of burning meat fat, which is what it is. These are used in the working areas of the castle, the kitchen, the stables, the servants' sleeping quarters. They are not used on the high table. On the high table, there are wax candles. Beeswax candles burn cleaner, brighter, and without the smell of the tallow, and they cost considerably more. A single high-quality beeswax candle in the 1400s could cost the equivalent of several hours of a labourer's wages. For a great feast, the number of candles lit on and around the Lord's table was itself a statement of wealth, a deliberate, calculated display of the fact that this household could afford to burn that much light. Candles were status objects. Light was a luxury. In the great hall tonight, the candelabra on the high table holds 6 beeswax candles all lit. At the lower tables, tallow candles in simpler holders provide the working light. Along the walls, the torches burn in their iron brackets, and overhead, in the centre of the hall, a circular iron chandelier, a corona it was sometimes called, or a chandelier, which is simply the French word for candle holder, hangs from a rope and pulley mechanism that allows it to be lowered for lighting and raising back up when done. It holds 12 candles, and when they are all lit, the hall is genuinely bright, the stone walls flickering amber on both sides, the high ceiling disappearing into shadow above. Margery descends the stairs from the solar with Anne just behind her. She pauses in the screen's passage, that wooden partition we mentioned earlier, with its 2 doors through which all the service passes from the kitchen to the hall, and takes a brief professional look at the state of the hall. She has been doing this every evening for 15 years, and her eye for the state of a room is exact. The tables are correct, the salt is placed, the candles are lit. The rushes on the floor look fresh. They were changed 2 days ago, and still have the clean, faintly herbal smell of dried lavender and rosemary mixed in with the reed grass. She looks at the head of the lower staff table. The bench at the head of the lower staff table has a slight wobble on its left leg. She has mentioned this twice. It has not been fixed. She files this away for tomorrow morning. She enters the hall. When the lady enters the hall, people notice, not dramatically. Nobody freezes or bows low. Those formalities are for more elevated settings than this ordinary supper. But there is a subtle reorientation in the room, a shift in the way people are standing, a slight straightening among those who have been lounging on the benches waiting. This is the natural gravity of authority in a confined space. Everyone in this hall knows precisely where they stand in relation to Margery, and the entrance of the person at the top of that hierarchy affects the room the way a stone dropped into still water affects the surface. Not a splash, but a ripple, moving outward in all directions. Margery walks to the high table. She takes her seat. Thomas the steward appears at her left and settles himself with the careful movements of a man who has spent 40 years managing his dignity in confined spaces. The chaplain, Father Hugh, a spare, precise man in his 40s with a voice made for echoing in stone chapels, arrives at her right and sits. The pages take their positions behind the high table, standing, ready. The bell rings again, shorter this time, 2 notes. Supper begins. The ritual of a noble supper in the 1400s is, by modern standards, elaborate almost beyond imagining. Even on an ordinary evening, no special guests, no feast day occasion requiring the full theatrical performance. The meal proceeds according to customs so deeply embedded in castle life that most of the people performing them could not have explained where the customs came from. They simply knew, this is how supper is done. The first thing that happens, before any food appears, is the hand-washing, not a quick rinse before dinner the way you or I might do it. A ceremonial presentation of water and linen, brought to each person of standing at the high table by the ewerer or his boy. A ceramic or metal ewer of warm water, scented perhaps with rosewater or herbs, a clean linen cloth. You extend your hands over the basin, water is poured over them, and you dry them on the cloth. This happens before the meal, and sometimes between courses. The symbolic weight of this ritual goes back through Christianity and through pre-Christian custom alike. Clean hands before eating sacred food, the idea that what you put into your body required a kind of preparation, a small ceremony of readiness. Nobody thinks about this consciously as the ewer is brought to Margery's hands. It is simply done because it is done. Famines, voya. The bread arrives first, before any other food, and it is placed at each setting in the form of a manchet, a small, well-baked white roll, dense and satisfying, for those at the high table, with coarser bread placed at the lower tables. The difference in the bread, by the way, is not merely about preference. White bread, finely milled, properly risen, properly baked, was expensive in the 1400s, requiring good quality wheat and skilled baking. It was considered both more refined and more digestible, and physicians of the era genuinely recommended white bread for people of delicate constitution and coarser bread for those who needed the fortifying roughness of whole grain. Whether this was correct medicine is debatable, but the meaning was clear. White bread was for people of quality. The service proceeds in courses, not in the modern sense of starter main dessert, though the structure has some resemblance to that. In the 1400s, a formal meal is organized into removes, stages of service in which multiple dishes come to the table at once, are set out, eaten from collectively, and then cleared to make way for the next remove. This is different from modern plated service, where each person has their own individual portion. Medieval table service is communal. The dishes are placed in the center of the table, and diners take from them using their knives or their spoons or, for softer things, their fingers, onto their trenchers. A trencher, in the 1400s, is transitioning from one form to another. In the earliest medieval tradition, the trencher was literally a thick slice of bread, stale, dense bread cut into a rectangular shape that served as both a plate and, at the end of the meal, as something to be eaten itself or given to the poor at the gate. By the early 1400s, wooden trenchers are becoming common in households of middling rank, and pewter platters appear at better tables. But the bread trencher has not entirely disappeared, and in Margery's household, the custom is still observed on ordinary evenings. The coarser trencher bread is set at the lower tables, while the high table uses small pewter dishes supplemented by manchet bread, which amounts to a sort of edible side plate. This detail, the bread you eat off of, the fact that the very surface of your meal can itself be eaten, tells you something so specific about this world that I find it hard to get past without pausing. In a world where almost nothing is wasted, where the kitchen account records every scrap, the idea that the plate itself might be consumed or given to the hungry makes a kind of total circular sense. Nothing exists purely as service object. Everything has a use, and after the first use, often a second. Now, what is actually on the table tonight? Margery's supper is, as Anne reported, built around roast capon and leek pottage, but these are the anchors, not the entirety. A castle kitchen producing supper for a household of 60-odd people does not serve just two things. The kitchen has been working all day and the table is full. Let us walk through it, because medieval food, real medieval food, not the Hollywood version with the comically large turkey legs, is one of the things that surprises people most pleasantly when they actually look at it carefully. The capon arrives on a large platter, roasted to a rich brown, glistening with its own rendered fat. It has been prepared with a sauce. In William the Cook's house, this means a sauce based on verjuice, which is the tart juice of unripe grapes or crab apples, combined with spices, ginger, certainly, and black pepper, and perhaps a little cinnamon. And possibly, if William is feeling ambitious tonight, and he sometimes is even for an ordinary supper, a pinch of galangale, which is a root spice related to ginger, slightly more delicate, with a flavour somewhere between ginger and cardamom. The combination of tart and spiced and fatty is one that medieval cooking returns to constantly, with variations, and it is genuinely delicious. Here is the thing about medieval spices that I think most modern people get slightly wrong. When we hear that medieval food was heavily spiced, we sometimes imagine this as crude, a way of masking the taste of bad or spoilt meat, a desperate measure by people who did not have refrigeration. This explanation is, by most culinary historians' current assessment, largely wrong. Spices were not cheap. They were not used carelessly or as cover for bad ingredients. They were used because spiced food was understood as refined food, because the flavors of ginger, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cardamom, saffron were genuinely beloved and genuinely associated with luxury. A household that cooked with saffron and ginger was announcing something. It was saying, "We can afford this. This household has resources. Come to our table." The leek pottage is served in a pottery bowl placed in the center of the table. Those at the high table receive it in a somewhat smaller vessel, more decoratively glazed, but the contents are essentially the same rich, creamy, deeply savory mixture, thickened with breadcrumbs and enriched with a little of the castle's good cream. On any ordinary evening, there is also fish, because the church's dietary calendar of the 1400s required abstaining from meat on specific days, Fridays, the eves of feast days, the entire season of Lent, and a well-managed castle kitchen was always prepared for fish days, with supplies of dried or salted fish, pickled herring, fresh fish if the estate included a fish pond, which many did. Tonight is not a fish day, but there are nonetheless small dishes of salted herring on the table for those who prefer it, and a plate of hard-boiled eggs in a mild mustard sauce. Oh, hone, there is bread. We have covered the bread. Buhorn, there is ale. The castle brews its own, in a brewery in the outer ward, a necessity, not a luxury, since ale was the daily drink of everyone in the household, high or low. Water in the 1400s was understood to be unsafe to drink without boiling or without some additive, which is why ale, slightly fermented, therefore marginally safer than plain water by medieval understanding, was consumed at every meal by everyone including children and including first thing in the morning. The ale on the high table tonight is a good brew, clear and not too bitter, with a slight sweetness from the malt. The ale at the lower tables is the same, which is one of those small equalizing facts about castle life that tends to surprise people. The lord drank better wine. The ale was the same for everyone. Reinding. There is wine on the high table, poured from a glazed pottery jug by the butler or his boy. The wine is French, almost certainly, because the wine trade between England and France was substantial throughout the medieval period, and good English households drank imported wine as a matter of course. Claret from Bordeaux, possibly, or wine from the Loire, which would be geographically appropriate to our imagined French castle setting if we place Margery there tonight. The wine is poured into a metal cup, silver on the high table, pewter at the lower ones, and it is not diluted with water the way Greek and Roman practice had dictated. Medieval European wine was drunk as wine, period. Margery takes a sip, looks at Thomas the steward, asks how the South pasture business is resolved. Thomas, who has been waiting for this question with the patience of a man who has served this household for 20 years and knows exactly when the questions will come, launches into his account of the fence dispute. It is not a simple matter. It involves 3 parties, a section of common land that 2 neighbouring farmers have each been claiming as their own for the better part of a year, and a third farmer who is tangentially involved in a way that Thomas is still trying to untangle. He presents the information precisely, without opinion, because his job is to present and Margery's job is to decide. This is the distribution of roles that has governed their working relationship for a decade, and they are both comfortable inside it. Father Hugh, the chaplain, eats quietly at Margery's right. He is not a silent man by nature. He has opinions, and he is not shy about them, but he has learned in years of sitting at this table that the supper discussion often turns to estate business before it turns to anything else, and that it is more comfortable to eat properly during the estate business portion, rather than talking through it and then trying to eat while Margery is already on to the next topic. He is having the pottage. He finds the capon slightly too rich for his taste, though he would not say so. At the lower tables, supper is louder. This is always the case. The high table operates at a particular decorum, not silence, not stiffness, but a certain register of conversation, a certain pace. The lower tables, where the household staff, the garrison soldiers, and the servants eat together, are a more varied, more vigorous social environment. There is laughter. There are arguments happening in low voices over things that happened during the day. 2 of the younger grooms are eating too fast and too much, as they always do, because they are 17 years old, and they have been working since before dawn, and their bodies are hollow. One of the kitchen women is telling a story to her neighbour, her hands moving expressively, her neighbour listening with a particular smile of someone who has heard this story before and still finds it funny. One of the soldiers, a man named Robert who has served the garrison for 5 years, is eating with the methodical focus of someone who has learnt to make the most of hot food while it is hot, because he will be on watch tonight, and the cold comes early in October, and the warmth of a good supper is something to hold on to. Hone. This is the great hall at supper. It is warm, it is lit. It smells of capon and ale and wood smoke and the faint herbal ghost of the fresh rushes. Every social tier of the castle is in this room at this moment, each at their appointed level, each eating what their station entitles them to eat, but eating together, under the same roof, in the same firelight, breathing the same smoky air. There is something in that arrangement, not equality, not quite, but a kind of enforced proximity, a shared physical experience of daily life, that I find unexpectedly humanizing when I try to really see it. Noblewoman does not end abruptly. Nothing in a medieval castle ends abruptly. Things wind down, they ease toward their close, they trail into the next thing through a series of small rituals that everybody performs without thinking about it too carefully. This is the nature of daily life that has been lived in the same way for generations. It has a deep, inherited rhythm that does not require anyone to make decisions at each step, because the steps are simply known. Supper ends the way the tide goes out, gradually, not all at once. The last remove comes to the high table. This is typically the sweetest, lightest part of the meal. What would eventually become dessert, but in the 1400s was understood more as a specific digestive moment. A collection of spiced wafers, thin, crisp, made from a batter including wine and spices, cooked between two patterned irons held over coals, dried fruit, figs and dates if the household can afford them, dried plums, little pillows of something soft and sweet in a world where sweetness is not routine, comfits, sugar-coated spices, caraway or aniseed or fennel, the 1400s equivalent of an after-dinner mint, except that the function was specifically medicinal as well as pleasurable, since spiced seeds were understood to aid digestion and settle the stomach, and hippocras. Hippocras deserves a moment of real attention because it is one of those things that sounds exotic but was, to people of the 1400s, something as ordinary and comforting as a warm cup of tea is to us. Hippocras is spiced wine, red wine combined with honey and a carefully calibrated mixture of spices, strained through a cloth bag called a Hippocrates sleeve, or Hippocras bag, named after the ancient physician because it resembled the type of filter used in pharmacy. The exact spice mixture varied by household and by cook and by season, but ginger and cinnamon were almost always present, along with pepper, grains of paradise, which is a West African spice with a flavor somewhere between pepper and cardamom, and often a little galingale. Sometimes a spice called cubes, which is a small peppery berry from Southeast Asia, making its way to European kitchens via the spice trade that ran through Venice and Genoa. The result, served warm in cold weather, was a drink of genuine comfort, sweet, warming, aromatic, the kind of thing that settles around you like a blanket from the inside. William the cook makes a good hippocras. He has been making it for this household for 12 years, and he has developed his own proportions, which he keeps in his head, and which he has not written down and will not write down, because a cook's secrets are his security. Margery likes it. She is drinking a small cup of it now, as the wafers and comfits are placed before her, and she is letting the estate business conversation with Thomas wind down naturally into the kind of comfortable silence that long professional acquaintance makes possible. Father Hugh has said a quiet prayer, the post-meal grace, brief and specific, thanking God for provision, and is now engaged in his own inner processes, which may be theological or may simply be the quiet satisfaction of a man who has eaten well. The lower tables are already beginning to clear, benches scrape, trestle boards are lifted off their supports by the servants. The rush of post-supper activity in the hall is purposeful and quick, not rushed but efficient, because the hall needs to be cleared before the evening can properly begin, and everyone knows their part. The kitchen boys collect the trencher bread that will be sent to the gate for the poor. The butler notes what wine remains in the jug and takes it back to the cellar. The torches along the walls are left burning. The chandelier overhead is lowered on its rope, and 3 of its 12 candles, already guttered, are replaced with new ones. The hall will be used again in an hour or so, for the evening gathering that, in a castle of this period, often involved some form of entertainment or communal activity. But first, the clearance, the brief interlude between supper and evening, when each person moves toward whatever their night will hold. Margery finishes her hippocras. She turns to Thomas. "Tomorrow morning," she says, "I want to speak with the head carpenter about the bench in the lower staff section, the left leg. It has been wobbly for 3 weeks and nobody has fixed it." Thomas, who noticed the bench himself and is mildly embarrassed that it has persisted this long under his management, says, "I will have it seen to tonight." Margery says, "In the morning is fine." She rises. The people nearest the high table stand as she does, a brief automatic courtesy. She nods. She walks back through the screen's passage, through the corridor, and up the stairs toward the solar, but she does not go immediately to the solar. She stops first at a door on the 2nd level, a door she knows by feel in the dark. She has opened it so many times. She opens it and steps inside. This is the castle's chapel. A small room, no more than 15 or 18 feet in either direction, but made to feel larger by the height of its narrow windows, which at this hour hold only dark glass and the distant suggestion of a night sky. Before the altar, a small lamp burns, the perpetual flame kept alight day and night before the sacrament, a tiny amber point of light in the darkness that Margery finds, as she always does when she steps into this room after supper, deeply calming. She sits in the one chair set at the side, not the chaplain's seat, which is reserved, but the ladies' prie-dieu, a small wooden kneeling bench with a cushion she embroidered herself 6 years ago, blue silk on white linen, a simple pattern of rosemary sprigs because rosemary was the herb of remembrance and there were things she needed to remember. She does not pray formally at this moment. Father Hugh will lead the household prayers later in the evening. This is something quieter, a few minutes in a room specifically designed to hold silence before the rest of the evening makes its demands. She sits with her hands folded and looks at the small flame before the altar and lets her mind go still for the first time today. A medieval castle chapel. Let me stay with this for a moment, because I think it is one of the rooms that most thoroughly defies the modern imagination of what castle life was. We tend to imagine the castle as the site of power, display, military might, and all of that is accurate. But it is also inseparably a space organized around faith in a way that modern secular life makes it difficult to fully comprehend. The 1400s were not a century of doubt, not for most people. The religious life was not optional, not decorative, not something you did on Sundays and otherwise ignored. It was threaded through every hour of every day, from the morning prayers that marked the beginning of the day, to the compline prayers that formally ended it, through the canonical hours in between, the grace before meals, the blessing over work begun, the prayers for the dead that continued for years after the death itself. The castle chapel was used, really used, multiple times daily. Father Hugh was a busy man. His duties included the morning mass, generally heard by the household shortly after dawn, the midday prayers, the evening service, the specific religious observances for feast days, fast days, saints' days, and there were many of them, a calendar so thick with holy observances that the year was essentially structured around them. He also heard confession for members of the household, administered last rites when death came, kept the record of baptisms and marriages among the castle's community, and served as the only formal point of contact between this household and the larger structures of the church. The church, in 1415, is complicated. This is not the era of simple, untroubled faith. The Great Schism, the period when there were simultaneously 2 or even 3 men claiming to be pope, with different parts of Europe following different claimants, has technically ended in 1417 with the Council of Constance, but the wounds are still present. People remember. The authority of the papacy has been shaken in a way that earlier centuries would have found unimaginable. There is quiet questioning in some learned circles, nothing visible yet in a small English or French castle, nothing that would reach Margery's ears as anything other than distant rumour, but something is shifting in the intellectual atmosphere of Europe. The Lollards in England are already being burned for heresy. John Huss in Bohemia has just been executed. Something is pulling at the fabric of the church, slowly, from the edges inward. Margery does not know any of this. Or rather, she may have heard the word Lollard. She may know vaguely that there are people in England with dangerous religious opinions, but it is remote from her daily experience. Her faith is immediate and domestic. The lamp before the altar, the morning mass, the rosemary on her prie-dieu cushion, the prayers for her husband's safe return, the prayers for the souls of her 2 children who died in infancy and who she remembers every day. The great theological controversies of the era exist at a distance from this small stone room, this small amber flame, this quiet woman sitting with her hands folded. She stays for perhaps 10 minutes, then she rises, makes the sign of the cross with a particular quietness that is not hurried, but is also not performative. It is simply the gesture of someone who has been doing this their whole life, for whom it is as natural as breathing, and she goes back out into the corridor and up the final stairs to the cellar. Anne has already been up. The fire has been built up again. A small oil lamp has been placed on the table near the embroidery, a clay lamp, a simple wick in a pool of oil, the kind that has been used for this purpose for literally thousands of years before this moment, and will continue to be used for centuries after. On the side table, someone, Anne probably, has placed a small pitcher of warm water and a basin, and a clean linen towel, and near Margery's chair, on the small wooden table that stands beside it, there is something else, a book. This is worth noting. Books in the 1400s are not what books are now. They are not mass-produced objects, available cheaply, owned by virtually everyone. They are handmade, each one the product of weeks or months of labour by skilled scribes and illuminators, extraordinarily expensive, treated as precious possessions that pass through families across generations, mentioned specifically in wills. A castle library of this period might hold 10 or 20 or 50 volumes if the family was unusually bookish or unusually wealthy. The most common texts were religious, books of hours, the prayer books of the medieval period, which combined the liturgical calendar with prayers for each canonical hour of the day, and were often illuminated with extraordinary artistry, psalters, Bibles, or portions of them, collections of saints' lives, devotional texts. But there was also secular literature, and in the early 1400s, secular literature in English and French has recently taken a remarkable leap forward in quality and ambition. Geoffrey Chaucer, who died in 1400, left behind a body of work that was already circulating in manuscript form across England. John Gower was writing. Christine de Pizan, in France, was writing, and Christine de Pizan is one of those figures I find myself genuinely reluctant to mention briefly, because she deserves a whole evening of her own. She was a professional writer, working from about 1390 through the early 1400s, producing poetry and prose that engaged directly with the intellectual and political debates of her time, including, and this is where she gets particularly interesting, a sustained, serious, and remarkably modern-feeling argument about the capacity and dignity of women. Her book, The Book of the City of Ladies, written in 1405, just about a decade before the evening we are imagining tonight, argued through a series of historical examples that women were not inherently inferior to men in intellect, virtue, or capability. She addressed her argument to the accumulated weight of male literary tradition that had said otherwise, and she took it apart with remarkable precision and wit. Did Margery read Christine de Pizan? She might have. It was circulating, it was copied and recopied. Whether she knew its specific arguments, or whether it had reached her in some form, a passage read aloud, a conversation with a visiting lady who had encountered it, or whether it had simply not reached her at all, I cannot say with certainty, but it existed, in her world, this argument, and I find it worth noting that as Margery sits down in her chair and picks up her book, in a world that has not yet given her a language for everything she already knows in her bones about the management of her own life, someone, not far away, was already finding that language and writing it down. The book in Margery's hands tonight is her Book of Hours. Kriebel saying, a Book of Hours it is difficult to describe one without sounding either academic or breathless, and I want to be neither of those things right now. Let me just say, if you have ever seen an illuminated medieval manuscript in a museum, one of those small painted pages with the extraordinarily fine lettering and the tiny jewel-coloured illustrations filling the margins, the gold leaf catching the light in a different way from any other surface in any room, then you have some sense of what Margery is holding. Her Book of Hours is not the most magnificent one that exists. It is not the Très riche Heure du Duc de Berry, which is the famous one, the impossibly beautiful one now in Chantilly, the one you sometimes see reproduced in books about medieval life with its calendar pages showing peasants ploughing in January and nobles bathing in May. Margery's Book of Hours is more modest than that, but it is hers. It was made for her, or for someone in her family before her, and her name is written in it in a neat hand on the first flyleaf, next to a brief prayer. The parchment pages are soft under her fingers from years of handling. She knows this book the way you know a beloved thing, not always consciously, just in the hands, in the weight and resistance of the pages. She opens it to the evening prayers. The Book of Hours was organized around the divine office, the 8 canonical hours of prayer that structured the monastic day, which had been adapted for lay use into a simplified but still rhythmically powerful form. The hours at night and the early hours of the morning are covered by matins and lauds. Prime marks the beginning of the working day. Tierce, sext, and none fall through the morning and afternoon. Vespers comes at sunset. And Compline is the prayer that formally closes the day, the last thing before sleep, the one that says, I have done what I can with this day, and now I give it back, and myself with it. Fans the nondo, Compline is what Margery turns to now. The prayer is short. The words are Latin. She understands Latin at the level of a well-educated noblewoman of her time, which is to say she can read it and follow the liturgy, and she knows the prayers by heart, even when she cannot perfectly pass every line's grammar. The meaning washes over her the way familiar words always do when you have heard them long enough, not as information to be processed, but as sound that carries meaning the way music does. below the level of analysis. Mul to be parnas, morning hails from farnachin cronompo, the finding maze real meaning boon. The prayer for those who are absent. These are Compline's themes, and they are the right themes for a particular hour of the day, the hour when the light is gone, when the work is over, when the day's efforts have done what they can do, and what remains is to let go. Margery lets go, or starts to. It takes a few moments of actual quiet before the hum of estate business, the fence, the bench, the bread, the letter she still needs to write to her husband, begins to recede. But it recedes. The fire in the hearth is the only sound in the room now, its soft, irregular voice. Anne has slipped out while Margery prays, and is now, let us follow her for a moment, because her evening and Margery's are entirely different, and both of them are interesting, making her way down 2 flights of stairs to the room she shares with 2 other young waiting women in a chamber just off the main corridor of the residential wing. It is a smaller room than the solar, naturally. 2 narrow beds, a palliasse, a thin mattress stuffed with straw, for the third girl who draws the short straw in the rotation, a chest each for personal belongings, a single candle between them. The room has no fireplace. There is a small brazier, a metal box on legs filled with glowing embers, but it does not fully warm the room, and the girls sleep in their woolen kirtles over their shifts for the cold months. Anne's situation in this household is, in the strange way of medieval social hierarchy, simultaneously comfortable and constrained. She is here as a companion and attendant to Margery, not as a paid servant. Technically, her position is a form of continuing education. She comes from a family of lesser gentry, and being placed in a household of higher rank than her own family's is considered a desirable path for a girl who wants to learn the management of a large household, who wants to make the right social connections, and who might reasonably hope that proximity to the lady of a castle will eventually result in a good marriage being arranged for her. In the meantime, she follows Margery, assists her, observes how everything is done, and participates in the life of the household in a status that is, and I want to be honest about this, somewhere between guest and servant, in a way that is practically and socially complex, and that probably produced, in individual young women, a range of feelings from contentment to quiet misery, depending on temperament, circumstance, and the quality of the household they had been placed in. Margery is not unkind. This matters enormously. A young woman placed in a cold or difficult household, with a mistress who is capricious or cruel, or simply indifferent, could have years of her young life made genuinely miserable by that placement. Margery is demanding. She has high standards for the management of the household, and she notices when things are not done correctly, and she says so. But she is not unkind. She remembers Anne's birthday. When Anne was unwell in the summer with a fever that lasted 3 weeks, Margery herself prepared the posset that the physician prescribed, warm spiced milk curdled with ale and wine, a drink that is both medicinal and genuinely comforting, and brought it up to the sick room. Anne has not forgotten that, in the small, intimate economy of a medieval household where closeness and hierarchy exist simultaneously and in permanent tension, these small gestures build up over time into something that functions almost like loyalty, almost like love, and is possibly both. Anne's 2 roommates are already in the room when she arrives. One of them, Cecily, the cheerful one, whose laugh is loud enough to be heard through a closed door, and whom Margery finds either charming or exhausting depending on the day, is sitting on her bed braiding her hair for the night. The other, Margaret not Margery, which is what they call her to distinguish from the lady, is already in her bed, facing the wall, either asleep or pretending to be asleep, which is a response to the day that Anne finds she understands completely this particular evening. They exchange a few quiet sentences. The capon was good tonight, Cecily observes. Better than last week's. Anne agrees. William is in a good mood this week. His surgeons of the Lord has sent word about when he will return. Anne says she does not know. The lady has not mentioned it. They do not say anything else. The candle is burning low, and they know better than to let it burn to nothing, which means someone will have to get up in the dark to find the chamber pot if needed, and the chamber pot is on the far side of the cold floor. So the candle is pinched out, the room goes dark, and 3 young women lie in the dark listening to the familiar sounds of the castle settling around them for the night. Meanwhile, somewhere below and across the courtyard, in the garrison quarters, the evening is proceeding differently. The garrison soldiers, the men responsible for the castle's physical security, who rotate through watches so that there are always men awake and alert at the walls and gates, are in their main common room, which is in the range of buildings along the inner curtain wall, a long, low space that combines sleeping quarters with a communal sitting area. It is warmer than most parts of the castle, because the bodies of 30 men generate considerable heat, and because the constable has a practical policy about keeping the fire going in the men's hall. Cold soldiers are slow soldiers, and slow soldiers are a problem. Some of the men are playing dice. This was technically prohibited by various church authorities and various castle regulations, but the prohibition was as consistently ignored in the 1400s as it was in every other century in which it was attempted. Dice were small, portable, and produced in limited evening hours with limited entertainment options, a reliable quantity of low-grade excitement. The betting was modest, small coins, an extra ration of bread, the forfeit of a particular undesirable duty the next morning, but it gave the game enough stakes to make it interesting, and interesting was in short supply in a garrison on a quiet October evening when nobody was attacking anything. A few of the soldiers are doing maintenance work, the repetitive, necessary, unglamorous maintenance of weapons and armour that is not the dramatic sword sharpening of popular imagination, but the mundane reality of oiling a leather strap, stitching a break in a mail cough, checking the edge on a knife, mending the sole of a boot. War in the 1400s, and there is war, persistently, the 100 Years' War between England and France has not ended, requires an enormous quantity of unglamorous readiness, keeping the equipment in order, keeping the horses fit, keeping the men from becoming slack in small but cumulative ways. This work is never finished, not completely, not ever. The constable knows this and the men know it, and they do it without drama, because it is simply what they do. One of the older soldiers, Robert, the one we noticed eating with methodical focus earlier, is sitting apart from the dice game, near the fire, doing something I find unexpectedly tender when I picture it. He is writing a letter, or attempting to write a letter, because Robert is not fully literate, not in the formal scribal sense, though he can manage his own name and certain basic words. He is dictating, actually, to a younger soldier who has a little more schooling, who is writing Robert's words onto a small piece of parchment with a stubby quill and a pot of ink that is going slightly thick in the cold. The letter is going to Robert's wife, who lives in the town 2 days' ride away. It says in effect, "I am well, we are quiet here, the pay is regular, I will be home at Christmas if the constable allows it. Take care of yourself and the children, God keep you." Literacy in the 1400s is a matter of degree and context. There were people who could read Latin but not write English, people who could write their name but not much more, people who could read a market ledger but not a theological text. The idea of literacy as a simple yes or no question comes later, with printing and mass education. In this world, you had what you had, and you used what you had, and when you needed more than you had, you found someone who had it and you worked together. Robert's letter gets written. The words get onto the parchment. The meaning travels to his wife. This is what matters. Lwyd and Mary hen you mouse. Let us go back to Margery now, to the solar, the fire, the book of hours, the close of the evening prayers, and you mind hollows. Eve lies mediumbia, his mafprus of Kempline prayers. She closes the book of hours and sets it on the table. She stays in the chair for a moment longer, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just being in the warm room, with the fire, in the silence. Home. There is a small sound at the door, not a knock exactly, more of a soft presence, an awareness of someone on the other side. "Come in," Margery says. Home. The door opens. It is the castle steward, Thomas, carrying a small candlestick and looking apologetic, which for Thomas means a very slight tightening around his eyes that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know him well. Home. He has a letter. A rider came while they were at supper. She would not have heard. The stables are on the other side of the outer ward. A rider from her husband. Thomas thought she would want it tonight rather than in the morning. She takes the letter. Thomas withdraws, pulling the door nearly but not quite closed, which is his way of indicating that he is not far if needed. A letter from her husband. Let us pause on this for just a moment, because the letters that survive from the medieval period, and some do survive, tucked into archives and estate papers, discovered by patient historians over the past few centuries, are among the most quietly extraordinary documents of the age. The passed-on letters from a family in Norfolk in exactly this period, the 1400s, are perhaps the best-known collection in English. They are letters between family members, between husbands and wives, between mothers and children, and they have a directness and an emotional reality that jumps across 600 years of distance with startling ease. They are not formal documents, they are people talking. They are people saying, "I am worried, I am tired, I miss you, send the money, be careful, come home." Margery's letter. We will imagine it because we cannot know exactly what it says, but we can know what letters of this type said from the evidence of letters that did survive, is from her husband, probably dictated to a clerk travelling with him, written in the formal legal hand of the period. It begins with the conventional salutation of the era, "To my right worshipful and well-beloved wife, greetings." This formula, "right worshipful and well-beloved," appears in so many letters between medieval spouses that it can seem like pure formality, and sometimes it was, but sometimes it was not. Sometimes the formula was the best available container for something that the letter writer genuinely felt, in a world where direct declarations of private feeling were not the cultural mode they would later become. "I love you and I miss you," difficult to write. "Right worshipful and well-beloved," less embarrassing, but carries the same cargo. "Penind we heas crundend." He has heard that there was a merchant passing through with good Flemish cloth, and he is trying to make contact before the man moves on. He hopes she is well, and the household is well, and he signs himself, in his own hand, at the bottom, even if the rest was dictated, with his name, and below the name, a small, slightly ungainly drawing that she recognizes as his attempt at a flower. He has been drawing this flower at the bottom of his letters to her for 12 years. He is not a skilled draftsman, and the flower has never substantially improved. She finds this, year after year, so deeply characteristic of him that it tightens something in her chest in the way that familiar things do when you love them. Rah! She folds the letter, sets it on the table, looks at the fire for a moment. 4 days, that is not very long. She calls out toward the door. "Thomas." He reappears almost immediately, which confirms her suspicion that he was hovering in the corridor, waiting to see if she would need anything further. He is very good at this hovering attentiveness that never actually feels intrusive. She has often wondered how he achieves it. She asks him to send word to the kitchen that the Lord will be back in 4 or 5 days, so the food stores for the week should be reviewed accordingly. She asks him to check whether the Flemish merchant Thomas mentioned has any contact in the market town near their estate, because she has been wanting to replace 2 of the large table carpets, and Flemish cloth is exactly what she has in mind for the new ones. She asks if the south pasture fence matter is likely to need the Lord's direct involvement, or whether she can resolve it before he returns. Thomas tells her it can likely be resolved before the Lord returns. He thinks so. He will pursue it. "Good," she says. "Thank you, Thomas. Good night." "Good night, my lady." The door closes. She is alone again. There is a particular quality to solitude in a castle, I think, that is difficult to name precisely. You are never truly alone. The walls around you are full of people. The sound of them moving through their various evenings is always somewhere at the edge of perception. The smell of the kitchen fire, and the sound of horses in the outer ward, and the distant exchange of words between guards on the wall walk above, are always present. And yet the solar, with its barred door and its heavy curtains and its own small fire, creates something that functions as solitude, a kind of chosen, bounded privacy in a world that has almost no other kind. Oh, Margery's world is on balance not a world of much privacy. This is something worth sitting with for those of us who have grown up with bedrooms of our own, bathrooms of our own, the ability to close a door and be genuinely unreachable. The castle is a communal life in a way that is simply assumed rather than chosen. The great hall is communal by necessity. It is too large and too cold for any one person to use alone with any efficiency. The corridors are communal by virtue of being corridors. Even the solar is regularly occupied by multiple people. Anne is in and out all day. The chamberlain comes by. Visitors are received there on quieter occasions. The only space that is truly reliably private is the space inside the curtains of the great bed, and that space is, on most nights, shared. Not tonight, though. Tonight the Lord is away, and the bed is Margery's entirely. She stands. She moves to the basin and the pitcher of warm water that Anne left, and she washes her face and her hands, properly, carefully. The way that you are as ritual at the dinner table is a formal version of this private domestic act. She has a piece of soft cloth for this purpose, and a small pot of something, beeswax and rose oil possibly, mixed to a soft paste, that she uses on her hands, which have been getting dry in the October cold. The smell of the rose oil is pleasant and specific, and it has been part of her bedtime routine for so long that the smell itself now carries the feeling of the end of the day, the way certain smells always do when they have been consistently associated with a particular moment long enough. Her hair comes down. This is a specific and different experience from the daytime, when her hair is always dressed, braided and coiled and pinned under a linen coif or veil, as respectable women wore their hair in public in the 1400s. Hair down, loose, around her shoulders in the candlelight, she is slightly more herself, or the self that exists only in private, the self that is not responsible for 60 people and a fence dispute and the quality of the bread. She braids it loosely for the night. The braid will keep it from tangling while she sleeps, which is, and this is such a small practical detail that it almost seems too ordinary to mention, but it is exactly the right kind of detail, something that women in every century have thought about and managed, quietly, efficiently, before bed. Hair management is not glamorous, it is just part of the body's honest maintenance. There is something I find actually comforting about this fact, that Margery in 1415 and you tonight, and every woman between and after, is somewhere in this common experience, this small practical act of keeping oneself in order before sleep. She changes from her outer gown to her night shift, a long garment of undyed linen, loose, high-necked, warm enough for the season. She does not have Anne help her with this tonight, because the fastenings on her night shift are simple enough to manage alone, and she wants the solitude. The outer gown, the heavy wool surcoat in deep blue, lined with a paler silk, one of her better dresses, she folds carefully and sets over the back of the chair. In the morning it will need to be brushed, but not tonight. Anju. She adds 2 more pieces of wood to the fire. Not too many. She does not want it to catch up high while she is asleep, and the chimney draws well but not infinitely well. 2 pieces. They catch quickly in the good coals and begin to glow at the edges. She pulls back the curtains of the bed and gets in. The bed is cold. It is always cold at first, even with the fire. The sheets are linen, not particularly soft in the modern sense. Linen of this period has a slight weight and substance to it that is different from modern soft-finished cotton, and the blankets over them are wool, heavy, warm once they have been lying against a body for a few minutes. Under the mattress, invisible now in the dark, the rope framework holds the mattress level. She can feel the faint give of it, the slight sag toward the center that is the characteristic feel of a rope bed, and that she has slept on for so many years that she would probably find a perfectly flat modern mattress strange and uncomfortable if she could somehow be placed on one. She draws the curtains closed on 3 sides, leaving the side nearest the fire slightly open, because the fire gives warmth, and also because she does not like total darkness when she is alone. Enough light comes through the gap to make the enclosure of the bed not pitch black, just dim, with a soft amber glow from the hearth. In this curtained space, with the weight of the wool blankets settling around her, the cold of the sheets is already beginning to ease. She lies on her back for a moment, then shifts to her side, facing the firelight. But the castle does not sleep yet. This is one of those things about the night in a medieval castle that I want to make sure you understand before we go any further into the dark, that the castle at night is not a quiet place, not a still place, not a place that falls simply and uniformly into rest. It has layers of wakefulness, a shifting pattern of people awake and asleep at different hours, a rhythm of light and dark and sound that continues through the whole night in a particular way that is nothing like the domestic silence of a modern house after everyone has gone to bed. The guards are awake. They are always awake, or supposed to be, which is not entirely the same thing. The castle's security depends on a rotating watch, with men posted at the gates and along the wall walk, and at particular internal points, changed at regular intervals through the night, so that no single man is required to stay awake so long that he begins to fail. The constable takes this seriously. Watchfulness is not optional. A castle that has been successfully besieged or surprised in the dark has, more than once in the history of the period, come to grief not through military defeat, but through a single negligent guard who fell asleep at a moment that mattered. This history is known. The lesson has been absorbed. The constable's reputation depends on it not being repeated under his tenure. The kitchen fire never fully goes out. Banks of coals are maintained through the night under a layer of ash. The same technique used in every hearth in the castle, the embers banked against the morning, ready to be woken up again rather than started from nothing. Starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel and tinder is not impossible, but it is time-consuming and annoying. And in a kitchen that needs to be producing breakfast before dawn, nobody wants to be starting from nothing. So the fire sleeps but does not quite die, and the boy who draws the early kitchen duty in the morning will find it waiting for him, breathable, ready. In the stables, the young groom watching the horse with the questionable foreleg is fighting sleep. He is 16 years old and he has been awake since before dawn, and the warm smell of the horses and the hay is not helping. He tips forward on his stool, jerks awake, sits very straight for several minutes with his eyes deliberately wide, then tips forward again. The horse he is watching shifts its weight, stamps once, settles. Its eye, visible by the light of the single small lantern the groom is permitted to use, is calm. The foreleg is fine. It will be fine. But the master of the horse said watch it, and so the boy will watch it, or will at least be present in the same space as it while fighting the particular battle with consciousness that every human being who has ever been assigned a night watch has fought. The chaplain Father Hugh is awake in his cell, a small room off the chapel wing, cold and spare in the way that the rooms of men who take their vocation seriously often are. A single narrow bed, a small writing table, a crucifix on the wall. He is reading, or trying to. He has been working through a copy of Augustine's Confessions for the better part of a year. In the slow, deep way he reads theology, not quickly, not for information, but meditatively, a few pages at a time, sitting with each idea for a while before moving on. Tonight he has read the same paragraph 4 times without fully absorbing it, and he knows this means his mind is elsewhere. The morning will come early. Matins is before dawn. He puts the book down, says a brief prayer in the darkness of his cell, not formal, just a few words in the personal, slightly casual tone he has always used for the private communications between himself and God that are not the official liturgy, and lies down on the narrow bed in his clothes. Ho-ho-ho-ham. He is asleep within minutes. Father Hugh has the particular gift of falling asleep quickly that belongs to people with clean consciences and physical tiredness, and he has both tonight. Ho-ho-hum. Thomas the steward is still awake. He will be awake for another hour at least, going over the household accounts in his small, precise handwriting by the light of 2 tallow candles. This is not unusual for him. Thomas does his best thinking in the late evening, when the household has quieted, and nobody is likely to interrupt him with a new problem. The fence dispute, the bread, the bench in the lower hall, the Flemish cloth merchant, which he will need to chase down in the morning with a letter of inquiry to the market town agent, the question of whether the south pasture can be resolved before the Lord returns, which he believes it can if the relevant farmers can be persuaded to accept a boundary that is slightly more generous to one and slightly less generous to the other, in exchange for an agreement that covers several years rather than being renegotiated each season. Boundaries that have to be renegotiated are not boundaries. Boundaries that hold are arrangements that everyone has accepted. Thomas has been making arrangements that hold for 20 years. He is good at it. He notes the items for tomorrow morning in a column at the edge of his account page, small and neat in his personal shorthand that nobody else can read. Then he goes back to the accounts. The laundry, somewhere in the lower wing, has fully quieted. Joan went to her bed an hour ago, the altar cloths finished and folded and set on the correct shelf. The laundry room smells of lye and wet linen and the last of the day's fire, and it will smell this way every evening for as long as Joan is alive and running it, which will be another 12 years, if the estate records of the period are any guide to what is typical. Joan does not think about this. Nobody thinks about how long their tenure will be. You do the work. Tomorrow the laundry comes back. You do it again. In the great hall, which is dark now but not entirely cold, the fire in the side hearth has been banked but not extinguished. A young page is sleeping on a bench near the hearth, wrapped in his cloak. He is 11 years old, the son of a minor knight who placed him in this household 4 months ago, and he has not fully adjusted to the castle's rhythms yet. He was supposed to go to the page's dormitory in the upper wing 2 hours ago, but he sat down for a moment near the hearth after supper to warm himself, and the warmth took him and he did not wake up. In the morning he will be gently scolded by the chamberlain, who will find him there in the early light and will not make a dramatic production of it, because the chamberlain has managed pages for 20 years, and the boy falling asleep in the hall after a long day is the gentlest of the many ways pages manage to be inadvertently inconvenient. The boy's name is William, a common name, like Joan, like Thomas. The medieval world ran on a small set of names repeated across every household and every generation. He is sleeping on his side with his cloak tucked around him, one arm bent under his head, and in this position, in the dim amber of the dying fire, he looks approximately 12 years old, and therefore approximately 12 years old, which is what he is, and there is something in that image, the child asleep by the fire in the great hall, the ancient hall, the old walls, that moves me in a way I find difficult to entirely explain. He is so small in this place, all of us are small in this place, but the fire holds him, and the walls hold him, and he is warm, and he is safe, and he is asleep, and for tonight that is enough. Let us stay with the castle for a little while in the dark, moving through it the way awareness moves through a place when the business of it has stilled. Die. The outer ward at midnight, October. The moon is, let us say it is gibbous, 3/4 full, because a full moon would give enough light to see clearly, and a new moon would give nothing, and the in-between is more interesting and probably more realistic for any given night. The moonlight falls on the cobbled surface of the outer ward, and makes the frost that has begun to form on the stones look faintly silver. The horses in the stables are visible through the high narrow windows of the stable building as warm shapes moving slowly, the sound of them, breath, the occasional shift of weight, a soft sound that is not quite a snort and not quite a sigh, drifting out into the cool air. Above, on the wall walk, a guard is moving along his patrol route. He is wearing a heavy wool cloak over his padded jack, the basic garment of a working soldier of the period, a close-fitting coat of layered cloth, sometimes reinforced with small metal plates that provides warmth and some protection, without the full weight and expense of plate armor, which is what you wear into battle rather than what you wear for a cold night watch. His boots are the heavy leather kind that lace up the calf. He can see from the wall walk across the moat and out over the dark fields beyond, the furrows of the ploughed strips running in their long parallel lines under the moonlight, the edge of the wood a dark mass to the northeast. Nothing is moving out there. There is no reason for anything to be moving out there. He is not expecting an attack. He is simply watching, which is what he is here to do, and the watching is quiet and cold and uneventful, and he has done it enough times that he has found a way to be present in the monotony without either falling into inattention or making himself miserable with the cold. He counts things. He has a habit of counting things he can see from the wall walk, the furrows in the nearest field, the trees at the edge of the wood, the visible windows in the main tower, the stars in the portion of sky directly above him. It keeps his mind gently occupied without exciting it. His name, also, is Thomas. There are a lot of Thomases. Let us go inside again. Let us know. There is something I want to tell you about the sleeping arrangements in a castle, because this is the part that perhaps most thoroughly upends the picture we carry in our heads. Not for Margery. Her solar and her curtained bed are, as we have established, genuinely comfortable, genuinely private, genuinely her own. But for most of the people in this building, the relationship with sleep, with the body's rest, with what we now call bedtime, is entirely different from anything in our modern experience. Servants in a medieval castle slept where they could, and in circumstances that ranged from tolerable to difficult, depending on their rank within the servant hierarchy. The highest-ranking servants, the steward, the constable, the master cook, the chamberlain, typically had their own small rooms, usually Spartan but private, with some kind of sleeping surface and a means of warmth. These rooms were not large. Comfortable was not the expectation. Privacy was the luxury. Below that level, the situation changed substantially. Many household servants in the 1400s slept in shared spaces, sometimes in large dormitory rooms, sometimes in corners of the rooms in which they worked, sometimes simply wherever there was a warm surface near a fire. The spit boys might sleep near the kitchen hearth. After the evening's cooking was done and the fires banked, the floor near the kitchen hearth was the warmest flat surface in the castle, and nobody was using it. The laundresses might sleep in a shared room near the laundry. The stable grooms slept in or near the stables, straw palliaces, thin mattresses stuffed with straw, laid on a wooden frame or directly on the floor, with a standard sleeping surface for most servants. They were not comfortable in the way we use that word. They were warm, and they were something between a person and the cold stone floor, which made them better than nothing, which was the relevant comparison. Straw mattresses were supposed to be refreshed periodically with new straw, but this depended on the household's organization and the availability of straw at a given time of year. Old straw palliaces were lumpy, thin in the places where weight had repeatedly compressed them, and potentially home to things that made them less comfortable than they looked. This was ordinary. This was Tuesday again. The pages, like young William asleep in the hall, had a dormitory in the upper wing, a shared room with several narrow beds, a fireplace that the chamberlain's assistant was supposed to ensure was maintained, but that was frequently let to go out after the boys were supposed to be asleep. The pages complained about the cold to each other rather than to adults, because complaining to adults would involve acknowledging that they had been awake when they were supposed to be asleep, which would raise its own complications. There is a particular quality of sound that a sleeping castle has, not silence, because the castle at night makes sounds continuously, the wind against the stone, the horses, the footsteps of the patrol, the settling of timbers in the residential wing, the distant sound of the river if there is one, the muffled creak of ropes in the well. But underneath the sounds, the particular texture of the breathing and sleeping of many people inside stone walls. It is a sound you would know if you lived here, the same way you know the sounds your own house makes at night, and it has the same quality of familiarity and reassurance. This is the sound of everyone being here, being safe, being at rest. Now, let us go back to something we have not yet fully explored, because I have been threading us through the evening in Margery's company, and I want to make sure we have spent enough time in some of the spaces that do not appear in any of the popular images of medieval castle life. Let us talk about the cost of this place. Undine. The castle we have been imagining, a medium-large fortified noble residence of the early 1400s in England or northern France, did not spring into existence fully formed. It grew over time, as most castles did, with each generation of the owning family adding to it, expanding, renovating, strengthening, updating. The initial construction of a major stone castle was one of the most expensive undertakings in the medieval world, a project that could absorb the revenues of a large estate for years or even decades. Historians studying the building accounts of English royal castles, documents that survive in unusual completeness in some cases, have calculated the costs of specific projects in terms that allow for rough modern comparisons, though all such comparisons are approximate and imperfect. The building of Beaumaris Castle in Wales by Edward I, begun in 1295, cost approximately £15,000 over many years, at a time when a skilled labourer earned around 3 or 4 pence per day. To rebuild that same castle from scratch today, accounting for the labour costs and materials, would likely cost tens of millions of pounds, possibly more. Windsor Castle, which was continuously expanded and improved throughout the medieval period, absorbed enormous royal expenditures over centuries, but these are the great royal projects. The private noble castle, the kind of place Margery lives in, was considerably more modest. A simple square keep tower with a basic curtain wall might be built for a few £100s in the 1300s or 1400s. A more comfortable residential castle with towers, a great hall, private chambers, chapel, stables, and proper water management might cost £2,000 to £5,000 to construct over several decades. These were still enormous sums in an era when a typical yeoman farmer might earn a few pounds a year from his land. A castle was a multi-generational investment, built slowly, maintained continuously, and passed down through inheritance as one of the most significant pieces of property a family could possess. The ongoing cost of running a castle was its own separate and considerable matter. The household accounts that survive from English noble families of the 1400s, the Parstons, the Stoners, the Plumptons, show households spending, at the middle noble level, somewhere between 100 and 400 per year on basic household running costs, not including extraordinary expenses like significant repairs or celebrations or war. The largest share of this went to food. The castle fed everyone inside its walls, remember, all 60 or 70 people, every day, 3 times a day. After food came clothing, the provision of livery, the standardized clothing given to household servants, which was both a practical expense and a statement about the household's resources. Then wages, though many household servants received food and lodging as part of their compensation and their direct monetary wages were quite small. Then candles, torches, oil, then horse-related expenses, fodder, shoeing, veterinary treatment. Then the 1,000 small continuous costs of maintaining a large stone building, mortar for cracked walls, timbers for floors that had softened with damp, iron fittings for windows and doors, lid for the guttering. A well-managed noble household like Margery's ran this with careful attention to the balance between what came in from the estate, rents from tenants, income from the sale of produce, timber, and livestock from the castle's lands, and what went out in all these directions simultaneously. Thomas the steward, up late with his accounts, is the person responsible for keeping that balance, and he is very good at keeping it, which is why he is still employed and why his eyebrows are the most expressive part of his face. The estate that supports this castle might encompass several thousand acres in total. The home farm immediately around the castle, where the most intensive agriculture and the direct food production happened, and the outlying tenanted lands where farmers held their strips of field in exchange for rent payments and labor obligations. The relationship between a noble household and its tenants in the 1400s was not the simple exploitative picture that sometimes gets painted. It was a genuine relationship of mutual obligation, complicated and sometimes adversarial, but also in many cases a functional arrangement that had been in place for generations. The lord or lady who treated their tenants badly found the estate poorly managed and the income unreliable. The lord or lady who cultivated relationships with the key tenant farmers, who settled disputes fairly, who did not press too hard in a bad year, they often found the arrangement surprisingly durable and the income relatively stable. Margery deals with these matters every week that her husband is away, and she has been doing so for 15 years, and she is better at it than she was at 30, and she was reasonably good at it then. She has opinions about which tenants are reliable and which will test every boundary given the opportunity. She knows which piece of land was disputed 2 generations ago and is still a source of tension between the current families. She knows which year the south barn roof fell in and was rebuilt and what that cost and who paid for it. This knowledge, accumulated over years of close attention to the life of the estate, is itself a form of asset, one that is entirely in her head, not written down, not transferable, not valued in any formal accounting, but absolutely essential to the functioning of this place. This is the other thing about noblewomen of the 1400s that gets systematically underestimated when we look back. The knowledge, the accumulated, experienced, essentially unquantifiable knowledge of how a complex operation works, built up through daily attention over decades, possessed in full by a woman who is officially not in charge of anything, whose authority is entirely derivative of her husband's, whose name will not appear in the formal legal documents of the estate, and without whom the whole thing would likely, gradually, quietly come apart. There is a word for this that exists in the historical record, a word used in medieval household manuals and in contemporary accounts of noble life, and the word is governance. The lady governed the household. That was how it was described, the governance of the household. Not management, not administration, governance. The same word used for the governance of kingdoms. Lemonjov, Lemonon heading von Harmonomio handing bu manwood, dear, I find this detail stays with me. Lemonjum, nondia handing bu menwon handing bu mend. Let us move forward a little, toward the later part of the night. Lemonia handing vach meal, inside her curtained bed, is not quite asleep yet. She is in that particular state between wakefulness and sleep that the middle of the night produces, where thoughts come and go loosely without quite connecting into the sequences that make up conscious, directed thinking. The fence, the cloth, the flower at the bottom of his letter, the way the candlelight landed on the salt cellar at supper, the altar cloth, which still needs perhaps 40 more hours of work before it is finished, whether the laundresses finished it properly, whether she should check tomorrow morning, or whether checking is unnecessary and slightly insulting to Joan, who has never yet failed to finish a thing correctly, the smell of the rose oil on her hands, de thaim jeden foim, Sleep is genuinely different in this era from what we experience today, and I don't mean the mattress or the curtains around the bed, though those matter. I mean something deeper about the architecture of sleep itself, Gothamia. I mentioned earlier, when we were imagining the colonial household in another story, the phenomenon of segmented sleep. The idea that before the industrial age, before artificial lighting changed the body's relationship with darkness and time, people typically slept in 2 phases rather than one long block. The first sleep, falling asleep after dark and sleeping for several hours, then a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, the watch, the first waking, lasting perhaps an hour, then the second sleep, continuing until dawn. This pattern is documented in medieval and early modern sources. It appears in ordinary language. The period of nighttime wakefulness had its own terminology, its own acknowledged routines. People used it for prayer, the night offices if you lived a religious life, or private prayers if you were a layperson who had absorbed the habit. They used it for quiet conversation with a spouse or partner, for the kind of thinking that daytime with its continuous demands does not permit, the slow, uncrowded thinking that happens when nothing is required of you and the house is dark and still. Margery will have a first sleep and a waking and a second sleep. She does not know this is unusual by any standard, because it is not unusual by any standard she has encountered. It is simply how the night goes. In the middle of the night she will lie awake for a while, perhaps pray, perhaps think, perhaps lie still in the dark with the ember glow through the gap in the curtains, and then she will sleep again until the earliest grey of dawn. She does not find this unsettling. This is simply the night. The night, in fact, in a medieval castle is understood as a different kind of time, not just darkness, not just the absence of day, something with its own qualities, its own appropriate activities, its own particular character. The canonical hours give the night a structure: matins in the deep dark of early morning, lauds at dawn. The bell that rings for matins will wake Father Hugh, and he will go to the chapel alone, since the full household is not expected for the night office, and say the prayers in the lamplight with his breath visible in the cold. Later, at lauds, the bell will ring again, and those household members who observe the full office, which in Margery's household means Margery herself, the chaplain, and perhaps 1 or 2 of the more devout staff, will gather. But before that, the deep middle of the night, the time the medieval world sometimes called the darkest hour, this was understood as the time of dreams, of visions, of the particular permeability between the waking and sleeping mind that feels different from any other time of day or night. Medieval people took their dreams seriously, not in the way of simple superstition exactly, but in the way of people for whom the boundary between the visible and invisible world was genuinely permeable, for whom the dream was a possible place of contact with the spiritual world, for whom the message of a vivid dream might carry real guidance worth heeding. Margery has a vivid dream at least once a week. She pays attention to the ones that feel significant without becoming obsessive about it, which is a generally sensible approach to dreams in any century. The night is long, let us fill it a little. Down in the kitchen, the coals breathe under their ash. 2 of the kitchen women have stayed late to begin the preparations for tomorrow, not the cooking, not yet, that waits for dawn when the fire's awoken, but the preparatory work, the vegetables that need washing and cutting, the dried beans that need to soak overnight, the starter dough that needs to be mixed and set to rise by the kitchen fire's residual warmth. These women, let us say their names, are Alice and Ellen, 2 of the more experienced kitchen women, the ones the master cook trusts with the overnight preparation, have been doing this together several times a week for 5 years, and they have developed the easy, parallel, mostly wordless rhythm of 2 people who share a task so well that words are rarely necessary. Alice cuts leeks, Ellen mixes dough, the fire breathes, the castle sleeps around them. They do talk, sometimes, about small things, the garrison soldier with the loud laugh who everyone finds either very funny or deeply irritating depending on the day, whether the new batch of ale is as good as the last, whether the Lord will bring anything interesting back from his trip. Sometimes when he travels he brings things for the kitchen, a spice from a market town, a particular kind of dried fruit, once a small book of recipes copied from the kitchen of a nobleman he had visited, which William the master cook read with deep professional interest and incorporated into approximately nothing because he had been doing it his way for 20 years and saw no reason to change. Ellen says something quiet and Alice laughs, briefly, and the laugh is absorbed by the stone walls without echo. In the dormitory above the stables, one of the younger soldiers is awake. He is homesick. He has been in this household for 8 months, which is long enough that the acute stage of homesickness is over, the first weeks, when it was sharp and constant, but not so long that it has fully become simply his life. He is 17. He came from a village 3 days' ride away. His mother is there. He thinks about her sometimes in the middle of the night, in the way you think about people who are simply always present in your childhood, and you did not fully understand what their presence meant until it was gone. He will write her a letter. He has been meaning to write her a letter for 4 months. He does not write well. He will ask someone to help him, the way Robert helped with the letter to his wife. The hun. He lies in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling is low timber, and above it the thatched roof of the dormitory building, and above that the October sky which is slowly clearing from the earlier cloud. He can hear the horses through the wall. The nearest horse, a grey gelding named, probably something like Grey or Grey Boy, because horses of the period were often named with straightforward descriptiveness that was easy to remember, is shifting in its sleep, making the small sounds of large animals at rest. The sound is oddly calming. The soldier closes his eyes. He thinks, I will write the letter tomorrow. He will not write it tomorrow. He will write it in December, when the winter has settled in enough that the evenings are very long and there is truly nothing else to do. Let us go to a room we have not yet visited. Follow me up the main tower staircase, past the solar floor, past the level where Margery is sleeping, up to the very top, to the roof. The staircase ends at a small wooden door, and outside the door is the battlements of the tower, the crenellated parapet walk, stone rising and falling in the alternating pattern of merlons and crenels that you have surely seen in 100 pictures of castle towers, and that has in real life a quality of stark beauty that no photograph or painting quite captures. The stone up here is rough, weathered, darkened on the north-facing surfaces with moss and lichen, cold under a hand. The guard on this tower is standing in one of the crenels, the open notch in the parapet, looking out over the dark countryside. He has been here for 2 hours and will be here for another 2. From this height you can see, on a clear night, a remarkable distance. The fields, the village a mile away, the mill at the bend of the river, the dark line of the road that runs south toward the market town. On nights of full moon, you can see the road clearly enough to make out a mounted rider at considerable distance. Tonight, with a 3/4 moon and the clearing sky, it is bright enough to see the fields and the road and the village with its single lamp still burning in what might be the alehouse or might be the house of someone unable to sleep. The guard is not thinking philosophical thoughts. He is cold and he is watching, and he is thinking about whether it is yet time for the watch to change, and whether the next man will come on time or will be 2 minutes late as he was last week, and if he is 2 minutes late again, the guard will say something about it, not in a dramatic way, just the simple statement of a man who was standing in a cold night wind for 2 extra minutes on account of someone else's imprecision. But he sees what we see, from up here, looking out over a medieval landscape at night in October, the darkness of the fields, the silver of frost on the road, the suggestion of wood smoke from the village chimneys and from the castle kitchen below, the stars, which are extraordinary from here, no competing light for miles, the sky fully dark, the stars as dense as powder, the Milky Way visible as a real thing, a river of light across the October sky that modern people who live in cities may never have seen with their own eyes, and that this guard sees every clear night, has seen it his whole life, and does not consider it remarkable, because remarkable requires a contrast, and there is no contrast here. That is simply the sky. He stamps his feet against the cold. looks south along the road. Nothing, nothing. Let us come back inside. The night is getting later, and the castle is as quiet as it gets, which, as we have established, is not very quiet at all, but is a different quality of sound from the daytime, lower, more intermittent, the sounds of rest and watch rather than labour. I want to talk about medicine, about what happened in this castle when someone got sick, because illness in the 1400s was present and persistent in a way that cannot be fully separated from the daily texture of life, and the castle's response to it tells us something important about both the limits and the resourcefulness of people who lived before the concepts we take for granted. Antibiotics, anesthesia, germ theory, X-rays had been imagined. The castle has no physician in permanent residence in the version of this household we are imagining. Physicians, formally trained university physicians, which is the highest tier of medieval medical practice, were expensive and rare, and mostly found in cities or in the households of the very wealthy. What Margery's household has instead is a working knowledge of medicinal herbs, maintained primarily by Margery herself and by a specific woman among the household staff, whose name is, let us say, Isabel, who has a particular reputation within the castle for knowing plants. Isabel is not a physician. She would not describe herself using any medical title. She is a woman who grew up on a farm, and whose grandmother taught her things, and whose grandmother's grandmother presumably taught her grandmother things, going back through an oral chain of botanical knowledge that extends so far back its origins are impossible to trace. She knows which plants for fever, which for pain, which for wounds that are slow to close, which for the cough that settles in the chest in winter. She knows these things the way she knows her own hands, not through formal study, but through years of accumulated observation, through doing and watching the outcome and adjusting. Nothing. In Margery's household, Isabel's knowledge is taken seriously. When someone falls ill, they come to her or they go to Margery, and in either case the same practical toolkit gets deployed. Willow bark tea for fever and pain, which contains something we now know as salicylic acid, the chemical cousin of aspirin, and which actually works. Honey for wounds, which actually works, because honey's antimicrobial properties are real, and the medieval observation that wounds dressed with honey closed more cleanly was accurate. Elderflower syrup for the cold symptoms that came with autumn, mint for the stomach, chamomile for sleep and anxiety, and here we are, in the 21st century, still drinking chamomile tea for sleep, which is either a testament to its efficacy or to the persistence of tradition, or, most likely, both. There were also treatments that did not work, or that worked by accident, for reasons nobody yet understood. Bloodletting, the practice of opening a vein to release what was believed to be excess or corrupt blood, was standard medical practice throughout this period and well into the future, and it ranged from harmless in moderate amounts to actively dangerous in the more aggressive applications, though the body's remarkable resilience meant that many people who were bled survived and recovered, despite rather than because of the treatment. Various herbal preparations containing ingredients we now know to be toxic were used for specific conditions, sometimes with real effects that were unfortunately not the intended ones. The line between medicine and poison in the 1400s was understood in theory but often uncertain in practice. What the medieval household was good at, genuinely practically good at, was supportive care, keeping a sick person warm, keeping them hydrated, providing easily digestible food, keeping the sick room quiet and reasonably clean, sitting with someone who was frightened or in pain. These are the things that made the difference between survival and death in many ordinary illnesses, and they required not chemistry but time, attention, and the willingness to be present. Isabel had these things in abundance. Margery, who during the summer's fever sat with Anne and brought the posset herself, had them too. The medical culture of the 1400s also included, inseparably from the physical practices, a spiritual dimension that is difficult for modern secular sensibilities to fully inhabit, but that was genuinely present and genuinely operative. Prayer was considered a medical practice, not metaphorically, literally. The invocation of saints, the use of holy water, the wearing of particular blessed objects, the saying of specific prayers associated with specific ailments. These were understood as having real physical effect in a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was much more porous than our current operating assumptions allow. When a person fell very ill in Margery's castle, Father Hugh was called not just for spiritual comfort, but as a medical resource, because his prayers and the sacraments he administered were believed to have real healing potential. Whether this is correct is a question I am not going to answer tonight, because it is not that kind of story. But I want you to understand that these people were not simply ignorant of better methods and fumbling toward the truth. They had a complete, coherent system of care that made sense within its own assumptions, and that system included physical treatment and spiritual treatment as inseparable components of the same whole. There is one more aspect of the castle evening that I have not yet brought you to, and it is something I find unexpectedly moving when I sit with it. Let us call it the evening that existed outside the official record, because a castle is not only the things that Thomas the steward writes down in his account books, it is also the things that happen in corners and corridors and small dark spaces between the official moments. Nothing. Somewhere in this castle tonight, two people are talking who should probably be asleep. Maybe it is a pair of the younger kitchen women, sitting in the warmth of the kitchen long past the time the master cook released them, not wanting to give up the warmth for the cold of the dormitory. Maybe it is two of the garrison soldiers, sitting back to back against the wall in the outer ward on a warmer night than this one, looking up at the stars and talking about nothing in particular, their families, their previous postings, a rumour that reached the castle last week about a battle far to the south, the question of whether the Lord will raise wages in the new year. Maybe it is something more private than that. In a castle full of 60 or 70 people, living in close proximity year after year, the emotional life that develops between them is rich and complicated and largely invisible to history. The friendships, the rivalries, the loves, they all happened here, in the same corridors and kitchens and dormitories. Two people who have worked side by side for years in the same space, develop their own language, their own jokes, their own shorthand for the shared experience of this particular life. A look exchanged across the kitchen during a moment of particular absurdity. An elbow in the ribs when the steward says something pompous. The way you know, after years, exactly which person to stand next to when the news is bad. None of this is in any account book. Almost none of it made it into any record that a historian can now find. The official life of a medieval castle is preserved in contracts and letters and account rolls and court records. The unofficial life, the actual human texture of 60 people living together in a stone building through seasons and decades and years, mostly vanished when the people who lived it died. But it was there. I am quite certain it was there. Because people are people, and wherever people live together in close quarters over long spans of time, they build an interior life, an emotional life, a relational life that is in many ways more real than anything in the official record. The salt cellar tells you about hierarchy. The account rolls tell you about bread and wool and candles. The letters, when they survive, tell you about anxiety and love and the weather and the desire to come home. But the thing I think about most when I try to imagine this castle fully, completely, as it actually was, is all the conversations that nobody wrote down, all the wordless moments of tiredness and warmth and the satisfaction of work done, all the small kindnesses and small irritations that made up the daily texture of 60 lives inside one set of walls, the page boy sleeping by the fire in the hall, Joan's expert hands on the altar cloth, Robert's letter to his wife with its plain news, the young soldier who will write to his mother in December, the two kitchen women in the warmth of the banked fire, talking about something that makes one of them laugh quietly. These are what I cannot stop thinking about. Let us go back to Margery. She has moved from first sleep to the middle waking. The fire in her solar has settled to a deep, quiet glow, not blazing, not dying, just breathing, the way a fire breathes when it has found its rhythm for the long hours of night. The amber light through the curtain gap is low and steady. She is awake, and she knows she is awake, and she is not concerned about it. This is simply the waking. She lies still for a while, prays briefly, in the personal, non-liturgical way, not Father Hugh's Latin, not the formal forms of the office, just her own words, addressed to the God who she believes is as present in this curtained bed in the middle of the night as anywhere else, for her husband's safe return, for the household, for the 2 small graves in the churchyard of the village church a mile away that she visits when she can and carries with her always when she cannot, gratitude in the general direction of everything that is still intact and functional, the horse, the fence, the bread. Thomas's eyebrows. A small sound from somewhere in the castle reaches her, not alarming, probably a door somewhere, shifted by the night wind through a loose latch. She lies still and listens for anything more. Nothing more comes. The castle breathes around her. She thinks about the altar cloth. She has perhaps 40 hours of work left on the border, and if she works an hour each evening and 2 hours each afternoon when the light is good, she might finish it before the Feast of All Saints, which is about 2 weeks away. She would like to finish it before then, because the chapel should have the new altar cloth for the feast. She will tell Anne tomorrow to. She stops herself. She will tell Anne tomorrow, not now. Now is not the time for household planning. Nothing. She thinks about the Flemish cloth. She has a particular colour in mind for the new table carpets. Not the dark blue she already has, which is heavy and useful but has been in the hall for 15 years and is showing it. Something lighter, a green perhaps, or a warm russet. Russet is fashionable. She has seen it at 2 estates she visited in the past year, and it wears well and holds its colour. Nothing. She thinks about the letter, the flower drawn badly at the bottom of the parchment. She smiles in the dark. Somewhere below, a clock bell rings. Most private households of the 1400s did not have mechanical clocks. Those were expensive, complex pieces of technology being developed in this period, mostly found in church towers and great public buildings. But the castle might have a simple striking mechanism attached to the chapel bell, rung by hand at certain agreed intervals through the night. 2 rings, the 2nd hour after midnight, or possibly 3 rings. She has always found it slightly difficult to count clock bells when she is half asleep. 3 rings, she decides. 3 hours from now it will be nearly dawn. Father Hugh will ring for matins, and the household will begin to wake, and the kitchen will be stirred back to life, and the day will begin again with the particular forward momentum that a large functioning household carries with it from the first moment of first light. But not yet. There are still 3 hours of night. Nighting, she pulls the blankets a little tighter, turns toward the firelight, and she is asleep again before the echo of the bell has fully faded. Nighting for the moment verleid, because I think there is something still to say about women in this world, about the particular shape of life for a woman of Margery's station in the early 1400s, that I have been circling around all evening and want to say more directly. The word we keep coming back to, circling without quite landing on, is the word power, and I want to be careful with it, because I think the easy narrative about women in medieval history has 2 equally misleading poles. One says, women had no power, they were property, they were voiceless, their lives were determined entirely by the men who surrounded them. The other says, women were secretly very powerful, they ran everything behind the scenes, the real authority was always theirs. Both of these narratives feel satisfying in a simple way that the truth rarely is. The truth about Margery's power is specific and bounded. She governs the household. This is real governance, with real authority and real consequences. She controls the keys, the stores, the daily management of 60 people's working lives. In her husband's absence, she speaks with his authority in all domestic matters, and in many practical matters that are technically the Lord's domain. She acts without waiting for his return, because waiting would mean things go undone, and things going undone has consequences. She is competent. She knows it. The people who work for her know it. At the same time, she did not choose this marriage. The choice of her husband was made when she was approximately 16, in the negotiations between her father and the man who would become her husband, who she had met perhaps twice before the betrothal was formalized. She accepted this because accepting it was the only option, and because the match was, in the relevant terms of the era, a good one, a man of reasonable character and adequate resources who has not proven cruel or capricious, which is not nothing and which she understood from the beginning as the best outcome she could reasonably expect. The marriage has become something more than that over 15 years, and 2 children lost, and 100 estate crises managed together, and a flower badly drawn at the bottom of a letter. But it began as a negotiation in which she was not a participant. Who hein dude? She could not own land in her own name during her husband's lifetime, with certain exceptions and complications. She could not represent herself in court without a male representative. If her husband died, her widow's portion, her dower rights, would be approximately 1/3 of the estate, and the remainder would go to whoever was the heir, and her continued residence in the castle would be at the discretion of that heir. These were simply the legal facts of her existence. She knew them, she dealt with them. She did not experience them primarily as oppression, because the concept of oppression requires a contrast with an imagined alternative, and the alternative, a world organized differently, was not available to her imagination in any concrete form. What she had instead was what she made within the structure she was given, and what she made was substantial. The household she governed was well managed, well fed, well clothed, and cohesive in the way that households are when the person at the center of them is both competent and fair. The knowledge she accumulated over 15 years of close attention to the estate was genuinely irreplaceable. The relationships she had built with tenants, with household staff, with neighboring noble families, with the merchants who supplied the castle's needs, these were real, durable, functional connections built on a reputation that was hers, personally, distinctly hers. None of this was officially her power. All of it was, in practice, her power. I have been thinking, as we have been moving through this evening together, about what women in Margery's position knew, not just the practical knowledge of the household, though that was immense, but the deeper knowledge that comes from being the person who is responsible for everything, officially recognized for almost nothing, and who has to find a way to hold that without it destroying you. There is, I think, a kind of quiet wisdom that this position produces in people who survive it with their character intact, a capacity for patience that is not passive, an ability to accomplish things through indirect means that would be beyond reach through direct means, a very clear understanding of who actually depends on you, what you actually control, what the consequences actually are of things going well or going badly. The estate agents know who to talk to when things get complicated. The kitchen knows who to go to when William and Thomas are at loggerheads. The garrison constable knows whose quiet word carries weight when the lord needs to be persuaded of something difficult. None of this appears in any official document. All of it is real. Christine de Pizan, writing her City of Ladies a decade before our evening, put it this way. I am paraphrasing, not quoting, because paraphrasing is what I do. She said that the virtuous woman is not the woman who is simply obedient, simply passive, simply content with whatever she is given. The virtuous woman is the woman who takes what she is given and builds something from it, who applies her intelligence and her care and her practical capability to the actual materials of her actual life, and does not waste energy grieving the materials she was not given. Margery, if she had read this, would have recognized herself in it. So she might also have had something dry to say about it, because Margery is not, I think, entirely without a sense of the absurdity of her situation. After 15 years of managing this estate, she is quite clear-eyed about the gap between the world's official account of her position and the actual daily reality of it. This is not bitterness, it is clarity. And there is something in clarity, especially clear-eyed clarity held without anger, that is its own form of freedom. She sleeps. The castle holds her. 3 hours until dawn. Now, let me tell you something about the morning that is coming, because the castle's night does not end the way our evenings end, with the alarm clock and the sudden obligation of the day. The morning of a medieval castle arrives in layers, the way everything in this world arrives in layers, through a process that has been repeated so many times that it has become entirely natural. The first sound before dawn is the chapel bell. Father Hugh, who fell asleep on his back in his clothes and woke before the bell needed to ring because 20 years of practice have made his body accurate, rings the bell for matins. The sound moves through the castle in the particular way sound moves through a stone structure, not a single vibration but a kind of sustained presence, touching every room, every corridor, every dreaming person in their bed or their straw palliasse. The first people to stir are the kitchen. Alice and Ellen, who may or may not have slept for a few hours on the kitchen settle, the wide wooden bench near the hearth that doubles as a sleeping surface when the night is cold and the dormitory is far, are already moving, scraping the ash from the banked coals, coaxing the fire back into activity with their breath, and with small pieces of split kindling that catch quickly and spread their light upward. The kitchen fire waking is a moment of genuine small beauty, the coals underneath, still orange and breathing, meeting the new fuel, the first tongues of flame reaching up, the warmth after the cold dark, the crackle of fresh wood. The kitchen is back, the stables stir. The horses know before anyone tells them that morning is coming. They have been awake and restless for the past half hour, the natural rhythm of large animals who are attuned to the changing quality of the dark. The young groom who was watching the horse wakes with a start on his stool and is enormously relieved to find that morning has arrived without incident. The horse is fine, the foreleg is fine, and he can go to breakfast. He stands up on cold, stiff legs and shakes himself and goes to give the grey gelding its morning water. The guards on the walls are exchanging posts. The night watch, done at last, is heading down the wall stairs toward the garrison hall and the prospect of breakfast and their beds. The fresh morning watch is taking their positions, blowing on their hands against the October dawn air, looking out at the fields where the light is just beginning to come, not sunrise yet, just the preliminary brightening, the sky going from black to a deep grey blue at the eastern edge. Thomas the steward is already at his desk. He woke at the first bell and was at his desk 5 minutes later, because Thomas does not linger in the transition between sleep and work. He has added the items from last night's margin notes to his formal task list for the day: the carpenter for the bench, the letter to the market town agent about the Flemish cloth, the South pasture farmers who need to be summoned and persuaded. He is reviewing the kitchen accounts for the week with a second cup of something hot, not tea, which has not yet reached England in this century, but a hot drink of some kind, possibly posset or warmed ale with honey and spices, the medieval answer to the need for something hot and fortifying in the early morning cold. Margery wakes a few minutes after the matin's bell. She lies still for a moment in the curtained warmth of her bed, registering the usual first morning inventory, the feeling of the day, not yet made but already present in some outline form, the weight and shape of what it will require, the fence, the cloth. She will ask Anne about the altar cloth progress this morning, Father Hugh, who will want to discuss the feast day preparations for All Saints, Thomas, who will have the overnight updates from his desk. She pulls back the curtain. The solar is dim, the fire is low, just coals, the room cooler than it was before sleep. The thin grey early light coming through the shutter cracks is enough to see by. She gets up. She is not a woman who lies in bed once she is awake. She has never been. Even as a girl, her mother noted it with approval. She wakes purposefully. This has served her well. She wraps herself in the heavy wool overrobe that hangs on the peg near the bed, designed specifically for the cold of early rising, warm and loose dark blue, and she goes to the window and pushes open the shutter. Ho, ho, cold air. October dawn air, which has its own particular quality. Sharp, clean, carrying the smell of frost and turned earth from the fields beyond the walls, and underneath it the first thread of kitchen smoke rising from below as the fire wakes. She stands in the window for just a moment. The sky over the eastern fields is going from grey blue to a pale silver gold. Not sunrise yet, not quite, but close. The village, a mile away across the frosted fields, is a dark shape with one chimney already smoking. The road between the castle gate and the village is empty. The mill wheel is visible at the river bend, still for the night, about to be released for the day's work. She looks at all of this for perhaps 2 minutes. The steward is waiting. The day is waiting. There is already something in the quality of the air that tells her it will be a clear, cold day, which means the light will be good for embroidery, and she can make progress on the altar cloth this afternoon. But first, 2 minutes with the view. The fields, the frost, the pale sky, the thread of smoke. She is here. The castle is here. The 60 people inside it who will begin their day in the next hour are here. The fence needs resolving. The cloth merchant needs chasing. The bread needs watching. There is a wobbly bench in the lower hall that has been on the list for 3 weeks, 4 days until her husband comes home. Her hands smell of rose oil, faint, warm, still present from last night. She closes the shutter. The day begins, and that, I think, is where I want to leave her. Standing at the window as it closes, on the edge of a new day, in the middle of a life that was complicated and circumscribed and full of work and full of competence and full of small private moments that nobody wrote down. Margery, whose name you will not find in any history book, whose castle, if we found it today, would be a ruin in some English field, or a renovated chateau on the Loire, whose keys are long dissolved to rust, and whose embroidery perhaps survives in a museum somewhere under a curator's label that says simply, English needlework, early 15th century, unknown maker. Unknown maker, two words that stand in for a life. I want to spend a few more minutes with you before we let this evening close fully, because there are things about this world that I have been holding lightly throughout and want to set down more directly. A castle like the one we spent this evening inside was, in its full reality, not a comfortable place for most of the people who lived in it. I want to be honest about this. The bottom tiers of the castle's labour, the spit boys, the laundresses, the stable grooms, the younger servants, lived lives of genuine hardship by any standard, not simply by comparison to modern comfort, but by comparison to anything we would call adequate, cold, physically demanding beyond what most modern people experience, subject to arbitrary dismissal without recourse, limited in movement, in choice, in the ability to change their circumstances. Some of them were essentially unfree in ways that shade close to the bound labour of the feudal system, though by the 1400s the legal status of serfdom in England was eroding. The Black Death we mentioned in another story, that catastrophic population loss of the mid-1300s, had paradoxically given surviving workers a measure of bargaining power as labour became suddenly scarce. By 1415, England's working poor were in a slightly better legal position than they had been a century earlier, which is a very relative kind of improvement. Life was short, on average, in ways that statistics can state, but that human imagination finds difficult to fully absorb. Not because everyone died young. People absolutely did live into their 60s, their 70s, beyond, and Margery's castle has at least 3 people in it above the age of 60. But because the middle years of life were so densely populated with hazard, childbirth, infection, accidents, the sheer accumulated effect of hard physical labour on a body without the benefits of modern medicine, that the average pulled down sharply. Joan the laundry maid, 42 years old, is middle-aged in the full meaning of that word. And yet, I keep returning to that yet, there is something in the density of this life, the way it is organised around immediate and real purposes, the fire, the bread, the cloth, the horse, the altar cloth for All Saints, that has a quality I genuinely cannot dismiss as simply romanticisation. These purposes are not abstract. They are not deferred to some future payoff. They are right here, in the hands, in the room, in the kitchen fire that needs to be woken before the household can eat. The work has weight. The care has specific objects. The connection between effort and outcome is immediate. I am not saying it was better. I am saying it was differently organised, and that the difference contains something worth noticing, even now. Especially now. Through the way the fire forced everyone into the same room, and the bell called everyone to the same chapel, and the great hall assembled everyone for the same meal, to create an intense communal life inside which individual lives had to find their own private space. We have mostly reversed this arrangement. Our lives are arranged for individual privacy, for individual schedule, for individual choice, and communal life is something we have to actively construct in the spaces between. Neither arrangement is better. Both leave something out. I think about Margery at her window. 2 minutes with the view before the day takes her. That feels like something. That choice, to stand for just a moment with the cold air and the frost-pale sky and the thread of kitchen smoke, before turning back to the fence and the cloth and the bench and the eyebrows of Thomas and all the rest of it, that feels like a practice, a way of locating herself inside her life before the life required her to manage it. We all do something like this, I think, or we try to. The coffee before anything else, the walk before the inbox, the few seconds before getting out of bed when the day has not yet touched you. These rituals of transition, of self-location before the day's demands arrive, seem to be something humans have always needed, in whatever form the life made available. Margery at her window, you in your bed, right now, at the end of this evening, which is almost the beginning of your night. The frost and the kitchen smoke have been replaced by whatever is outside your window, real or imagined. But the moment is recognizable across 600 years. You are here. The world is here. Tomorrow will ask things of you, but not yet, not for a little while longer. Let the castle settle around you as you drift now. Let it become the comfortable, warm, layered sound of it. The fire, the horses, the guards on the wall making their slow counted rounds, the kitchen breathe smoke, the page asleep in the great hall, Joan's hands at rest on the folded linen, Robert's letter finished and waiting for the morning rider, the spitboys asleep near the kitchen hearth, with their faces still slightly warm from the fire they turned all evening, Thomas writing in the margin of his account book in the shorthand no one else can read, Father Hugh dreaming his precise and probably orderly dreams in his narrow cell. The and thing, for all of them here, all of them under the same frost-bright October sky, behind the same walls that have been standing since the century before anyone in this story was born and will stand, more or less, for centuries after everyone in this story is gone. For the stone is cold, the fire is warm. The night is most of the way through now. The matins bell has rung and the kitchen is waking, and somewhere below the solar there is already the faint smell of new wood catching, which means warmth is coming, which means morning is coming, which means the day will arrive with all of its requirements. But you can be here for a moment longer, with the frost on the fields, with the pale beginning sky, with the sound of 60 people resting and waking in the slow, inevitable turn from dark to light. Let yourself be here, inside these old walls, for just a little while. You have nowhere you need to be tonight except exactly where you are. No fence to resolve, no bench to repair, no letter to dictate. Just the warmth of whatever is around you, and the quiet of the night that is still going, and the very old, very human comfort of being inside, being safe, being held by walls while the dark world presses gently against them from outside. Sleep well, my friend.